Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Was the Most Dangerous Student at UA? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Izuku has gotten used to being underestimated for the majority of his life. It's been because of many things throughout the years. Quirklessness, small physique, shy outward nature etc. Stupid things he can't really control, but he's learned to live with it. He uses it to his advantage now. In middle school he'd been bullied, yes, but he'd come to understand that if he played the part of small, weak, cry-baby Deku, people left him alone. Sure, Bakugo was lecherous in his attempts to put Izuku down, but despite that it worked. People saw what they wanted from him, and because he played the part he was left alone. It wasn't foolproof, and sometimes other people besides Bakugo would try their luck. But even then, because they underestimated him and only saw a weak child who could never be at their level, they went easy. And in the slips in their guards because, what's Deku gonna do? Snitch. He learnt everything he needed to avoid them, to beat them, to break them. As he'd grown older, wiser and jaded to an extent, he'd gotten better at slipping behind the facade of a shy, quirkless boy who dreamed too big and wouldn't hurt a fly. He never had friends, but despite his quirklessness he had been generally well-liked by his classmates. And the facade that he had developed to buffer the attention from his real calculating and frustrated nature had only ever been questioned once. Don't you worry that one day he'll snap? Just because he doesn't have a quirk doesn't mean he couldn't kill someone. Izuku had pretended to be engrossed in rereading his hero notes. His last 2 books had started to have segments of villains and criminals, including things that made them hard to catch and things that made them good at escaping. There had been a laugh from the general direction the question had come from. Deku? Seriously? The guy could get knocked over by a strong breeze. He isn't dangerous. The query was forgotten and life had continued as normal, but it had gotten Izuku thinking. So far his facade had been a bullying deterrent. A way to keep the dogs off his scent, so to speak, so that he could follow his dream to the best of his abilities without Bakugo and his cronies yapping at his heels the entire time. After being told that he didn't appear dangerous, he'd understood that that was something he could use. After all, the minimal footage and exposure Eraserhead had proved that he was an unassuming figure and didn't look strong or dangerous. Eraserhead used that and took his enemies down quick and hard, with nothing more than speculation as to how. With that knowledge he'd asked his mother for martial arts training, they'd whittled away, arguing and presenting reasons as to why and why not. Eventually they'd settled on self-defense, and it was there that he learned his most important lesson: never underestimate your opponent, let them underestimate you. It continued from there. Self-defense turned to taekwondo, and that turned into nothing else as he disciplined himself and tried as hard as he could to progress, but nobody learnt belts overnight. In the dojo it seemed that the only place he would not be underestimated was in the ring. For that he was grateful. As 2 years passed, as he became less jaded and more open to his fellow trainees, he still never had friends. Quirklessness was still a barrier many refused to breach. His classmates began to solidify this image of him in their heads. Quirkless. Bakugo insisted that he was a lying, cheating BSRD who was looking down on them because did they not see that he was getting stronger, that he was becoming more confident behind his cheap little mask that he put up? Thankfully, nobody believed Bakugo, and over time the accusations dimmed, becoming less angry and more resigned. More targeted that no matter how strong he thought he was, he would never be as strong as Bakugo. From that, Bakugo also underestimated him. It carried over to UA as well. He'd been surprised at that. Hadn't they seen him at the heart in mouth, broken finger and murder in his eyes, throwing himself at the Nomu, at Kurogiri with the intent to harm? Hadn't they seen him in the sports festival, eyes wide and manic, power shattering his body as he broke through layers and layers with a sledgehammer of spite and sheer force of will? And hadn't they heard him in the stands, when Uraraka asked him what he was writing about and he revealed that he had files on all of them? Hadn't they seen, heard about Diamond? Hadn't they read about the involvement he had with the Stain case? How he had supposedly helped Endeavor into taking down the hero killer? They had, And yet the idea remained that Midoriya Izuku was not dangerous. He was kind, caring, a crybaby at times but a determined kid at the end of the day. Nobody dangerous. Reading between the lines, he realized something. For years people hadn't not found him dangerous, they'd always assumed he wasn't dangerous to them. It was a game changer then, realizing that people didn't see him as a threat because he never seemed like one. Bakugo was never perceived as a threat, because he was considered violent and dangerous. He wasn't dangerous towards the class. He blew up and swore yes, but he didn't intentionally hurt people. He didn't sit awake at night planning how to take his classmates down in every situation his mind could conjure up. Or, at least, he didn't think Bakugo did. Maybe he did, and he and his childhood friend were disturbingly similar in that regard as well, the first point of disturbing similarity being their unwavering love and devotion to All Might. And then there was his mentor. Even All Might, symbol of peace, man of many smiles and seasoned hero of nearly 40 years, didn't see him as dangerous. He was more open with his mentor, the facade sliding away to hopefully prove that he could be dangerous if he wanted to. It didn't happen. Instead, he was constantly told how much of a hero of the people he was, how unthreatening he was, and how admirable that was in a future hero candidate that had always bitten at him. He didn't want to be dangerous or seen as a threat, but he wanted to be seen, to not be shy, awkwardly friendly Deku or slightly intense, scholarly Deku, and he most certainly wanted to stop being seen as goody-goody Deku. In thinking it over, he realized that he wanted to stop being Deku and start being Midoriya Izuku again. Midoriya Izuku swore. Midoriya Izuku had near-obsessive notes on heroes, villains, and classmates so that when push came to shove he could fight. Midoriya Izuku sat up late at night running contingency plans through his head. His friends, family, and teachers are the subject of many ludicrous plans that would never happen, and his mind bending and flipping 100 different ways to fix them problems. Deku didn't do any of that. He was quiet, mumbled a lot, and got nervous around new people before morphing into a slightly less quiet and less nervous kid who rambled on about heroes. It was like two sides of a coin. Heads and tails, mirrored yet reversed. The only time he could be Midoriya Izuku was around people from other classes, like Shinso and Mei. He'd spent a few lunchtimes hiding away in Mei's lab, chatting and helping her tinker with and think away at new babies, while Shinso lounged on the beaten and dead sofa Mei had pushed up against the wall in her supposedly shared workshop, occasionally interrupting debates with input of his own and the more occasional summons to look at cute cat pictures. There was never another inventor in the lab, and the door read only his friend's name. So Izuku was starting to think the lab partners had either requested a move and Mei never noticed, or the pink-haired gremlin had pulled a Neon Evangelion. Midoriya Izuku thrived in the workshop, where he could discuss the lethality of his plans without provocation and without judgment, the other two joining in saying when it went too far or when he could push it just that little bit more. He thrived where he could lie down and tension could leave his shoulders, and he could swear and scowl and not be happy and smiley. And he could be tired and stressed. There was another occasion he could be himself as well, though this one was constantly overlapping with the first. Minoma Nido was a frequent visitor at the Hatsum Forge. It was supposed to sound intimidating apparently, but it made Izuku think of a soft JRPG NPC location, constantly asking about support items and licenses, and, when the sun and moon were in the right positioning, he seemed to also enjoy having a normal conversation. They'd begrudgingly gotten used to each other, and at times Minoma joined in with debates between himself and Mei. Sometimes the blonde would just speak with Izuku out of sheer wanting to about various topics. The sports festival, despite causing him to injure his arms beyond repair, had gifted him with friends and an unlikely acquaintance, though he suspected Minoma would drop dead before admitting it. He was thankful. Uraraka, Ida, Todoroki, and Tsuyu were all wonderful people, but Izuku had to admit that the company of Mei, Shinso, and Minoma was more welcome at times than the near-suffocating friendship with the others. Since being given the opportunity to be free, he'd felt confined. The constant use of Deku and Midoriya rather than Izuku, Mido, and Idiot, Minoma often sounded calm when he called him that, no venom visible or heard, hit home how tightly he kept his more open personality close to him. He, again, felt so thankful that he'd had the opportunity to be close to them. He was especially thankful when exams started up and Monoma agreed to help him study, claiming that 1A's poster child needs to be at the top of his game. He'd never been given an explanation on the poster child comment, but the blonde's tutelage had helped exponentially and he'd exited most of his exams with a breath of relief rather than of despair. The post-test haze that had settled over the class had been pushed aside as some classmates made up for lost time getting back into hobbies while others trained hoping for the opportunity to release their quirks to their heart's desires. Then you had others, like Hagakure, Ashido and Kaminari who had gone information hunting. They'd come back with news of practical exams. Of tales from 1B's class rep, Kendo was nice, she was another he could relax around, about past years' experiences. Entrance exam reruns, days after days of spontaneous hero practicals, and the more intense ones being week-long lockups in training grounds. He'd been enticed by the idea of that last option, and soon discovered that it was a simulation test. The hero classes would alternate between who had the leaders in it. It changed each year this particular exam ran apparently, and then the two leaders would be named either villain or hero and they were given a week to prepare before being locked in a training ground for a week. The objective was to test both sides on different parameters. The villain's prompts were often to create havoc, to create as real a simulation as possible. The footnotes on the documents he read through detailed about how they were judged on acting as well as actions. Alongside that they had certain parameters to meet. Things to steal, people to kill and places to destroy. With the added bonus prompt of killing off as many heroes as possible. Clearly the leader and their team were assumed to be those who would consider going into underground or undercover positions, so playing the villain would be practice, he guessed. Reading through some of the past schemes he realized it was also an opportunity for people to learn to think outside the box, to make a situation fit for them, instead of waiting for it to. The hero's prompt was much simpler. Take the villains and don't kill them unless absolutely necessary. There was no indication of fake weaponry in the guidelines, so he suspected it was the prerogative of the students to find a way around this. Stop the villains' plans and get them to surrender before the week-long exam finished. Reading through the few reports, the activity received controversy each time it was activated, so it happened once for each year every decade. He saw that the longest the 7-day time limit had lasted was 3 days. And the 3 times it had been run heroes had never lost. Spurred on by interest, he soon found himself diving into rule books, theories and data analysis from past students on the exam. It was such an interesting concept. More invigorating, more spontaneous and more fitting of up-and-coming heroes in their world today. The concept of the activity was to teach the villains to work under intense pressure and against stacked odds and learning to trust your gut and ignore moral guidance for the greater good at times. And the concept was also to teach both sides how to deal with city warfare and sieges. Something that as of late was becoming a bigger and bigger threat. It had been massive in the early years of heroism. As villains and heroes alike acted more like soldiers rather than peacocks with nuclear explosives strapped to their chests. Now, his generation was coming into a world of heroism where a battle between a hero and a villain was not too different from a war anymore. He didn't get his hopes up and went back to training for the 2 most obvious choices for their exams. A redo of the entrance exam and a week-long spontaneous heroics class. He was shocked when 2 days before the announcement for what their practical exam was going to be they were told they would be living in dorms. The only explanation given was that the school had been meaning to for years and decided now that with all the encounters the first years had had they were finally sold. Not to mention, Present Mike had told them, training camp was coming up after the exams finished. Wasn't it better to get used to sleeping under the same roof sooner rather than later? Izuku was fine with it as long as he didn't room with Mineta. UA had bullshit reality warping methods for doing everything. All students and staff, past and present, were aware of this. Still, Izuku was slightly bewildered how after 2 days the dorms were done and he was moving in. That excitement and bewilderment was discarded as Aizawa stood in the common room after dinner. Tonight, 2 of your classmates will have slips under their doors indicating whether they are the hero leader or the villain leader. He simultaneously felt his stomach drop along with everybody else as at the same time his brain jumped for joy. He was getting the exam he wanted. He'd spent the rest of the night in the common, half engaging in conversation with his classmates as he texted Shinso and Mei, before switching to the group chat where he read through about 7 paragraphs of Monoma complaining that one got to be the leaders of the exercise. Reading through all the paragraphs, because Monoma could be insightful at times, he discovered that the leader's job was to recruit, Vlad King having explained that tomorrow the leaders would be debriefed, but as 1B had no major role in the game other than as pieces they were being told ahead of time. The job was to recruit, train, and prepare. He wondered who the staff would pick for captains. The hero candidates were obvious, either Bakugo or Todoroki. Bakugo, due to his overwhelming physical abilities and unstoppable determination, demonstrated the stereotypical qualities of a well-to-do hero like All Might or Muriko. Todoroki, on the other hand, exemplified the self-containment and finesse of many heroes, as well as being a hero descendant who had been trained to one day take his father's place. Of course, depending on who was picking the leaders, and Aizawa could tell him it was random all he wanted, but Izuka hadn't spent years picking apart people to be fooled by such an obvious lie. It could be a complete left-field candidate like Shuji or Hagakure. His classmates were all strong and had different qualities that would make them all suitable for the job. The only problem was that many of them lacked the confidence to lead. Adding that to the fact many of them hadn't gotten to show off their strength, it would be near impossible to gather support from 1B students or from other classes. Aizawa had said after all that it was a year-wide exercise. Not just a hero course one. In one of the reports he'd read on this exercise, at one point the villain team had been made up of near exclusively support course students. That had the year it had stretched on for 3 days, the support gadgets giving the outnumbered students an unexpected edge. Their downfall had been that there was only one offensive quirk, and most of the support course students needed close quarters to activate their quirks, something their gadgets negated. "What are you doing, Deku?" Breaking from his thoughts, he saw Uraraka sitting next to him on the couch, glancing at his phone with confusion and concern. Looking down, he realized he'd opened his notes at some point and he'd been writing down his thoughts. Just got an idea, wanted to write it down. It was half true. A lie was always more believable if it was born from a truth. Her confusion melted away, any and all concern leaving her eyes instantly. She smiled and started speaking. Something about him just seeming so engrossed that she just wanted to make sure he was okay. He gave a generic response to that, and once confirming he was okay, she turned back to Tsuyu. He shoved his phone in his pocket once her attention was diverted, stretching and making his way to his room with no announcement. People didn't really notice when he came and went. That was something he relied on. The letter that sat on the floor inside his room stared up at him, teasing him. He could already tell from the design of the letter what side of the coin he was. The matte black envelope and authentic-looking red wax seal aesthetic didn't give any illusions. Closing the door behind him, he ignored the letter and placed his phone on his desk, saving the notes he had been typing downstairs before opening up the audio recorder. "With UA." He couldn't be too sure how long the contents of his letter would survive once he broke the seal. Starting the recording, he picked up the letter and sat at his desk, taking out the slip of paper that rested atop of the folded-up packet of papers and reading aloud. "Dear Midoriya Izuku, you have been randomly picked to be the leader of the villain team in this year's UA survival course. You will find the rules and regulations you are expected to adhere to in the packet included in this envelope." He paused, taking out the packet and placed it on the table. It didn't look particularly thick. That meant either there were a lot of loopholes or each rule was ridiculously thorough. "The basic premise of your mission is to recruit members of your year group." He stressed the use of the word year. Future reference of that would be important. "And to train and prepare for a week before a week-long lockup in one of UA's training grounds. The objectives for that week will be revealed tomorrow by your teacher. As a team leader, it is your prerogative to keep your identity secret or out in the open." That made him pause. If it was his prerogative, does that mean that the hero leader was given the same options? Or as a villain, traditionally with leaders hiding in shadows and behind organizations, was it a special privilege to keep his identity hidden? Your identity either way will be hidden from the hero leader and vice versa. This is to eliminate as much as the staff can any pre-planned attacks against leaders. "I look forward to seeing your potential, Midoriya Izuku," sighed Principal Nizu. Saving the audio recording, he set the letter down on his desk and closed his eyes, leaning back. He held his breath for a few seconds before releasing it in an effort to keep himself calm. It was futile, as his fingers were already itching and scrambling for one of the many pens and sheets of paper he had on his desk. He was going to have to plan and plan and plan. Fail-safes would be important, and plans would have to be linked to fail-safes. One way of doing it would be that each fail-safe stemmed from where something in a plan could go wrong and could eventually lead to the original plan again, or lead to another fail-safe depending on the nature of the slip-up. He resisted the urge to grab pen and paper, though. He didn't know his objectives, though he suspected they would be the same as years prior. He didn't know who his rival was, and again he already had suspicions, and most importantly he didn't know who his team would be just yet. That, however, he could solve. Opening his eyes, he grabbed his phone and dialed his first number. "Hey," he said when a half-aware hello was shot at him. "What do you say to being locked in a training ground for a week?" He felt a grin stretch along his face at the answer. "I'm not hearing a no. Who do you think the villain leader is?" He kept half an ear on the conversation while he transferred most of his notes on his class into a new notebook. This new book would serve as a class-centric guide to quirks and weaknesses. He was glad that it was only him on his row right now. It would be hard to hide what he was doing if Bakugo or Mineta could hear his murmuring and see his work. "I don't know. I can't see anyone in our class playing a villain, to be honest." He kept his grin to himself. There was yet again another opportunity to be underestimated here. If they kept that line of thinking, he would already have won part of the war. Midoriya, a presence looming over him, made his attention divert fully. Standing next to his desk were two of his classmates, blocking line of sight of him and of what was going to be discussed. Shuji, Koda. The two boys stood paired, nothing too suspicious. Koda was a skittish, brave at heart, but generally too nervous to start confrontation. Kid and Shuji had taken to accompanying the other boy sometimes as moral support. It could also have been Koda's selective mutism and the other's capabilities in sign language, but he'd seen the genuine friendship there. They surveyed each other for a few moments, before the six-armed boy seemed to find the words he wanted to say. "We'd like to be on your team." It was said low and quiet so as to not draw suspicious glances or wandering ears. "I'm not the hero leader." He knew neither were stupid, but he wanted to make sure they knew what they were signing up for. He also wanted to see what made them so sure it was him. "We're aware." He could swear that behind the mask Shuji was smirking. "However, you don't let anything slip past you, and this means you have what it takes to win. And we want to win." It was Koda speaking up that sold him. If so much confidence was held in the usually timid voice, then he had no other choice, did he? "Perfect." He smiled, a Midoriya Izuku smile, not a Deku smile, and he was glad to see no hesitancy enter their eyes. "Because that's also what I want to do. Aizawa hasn't briefed me yet, so I'm unsure of what our aim is. However, think you could make a list of people you think would like to join our cause." Oh, Shuji was definitely smirking now. "You got it, boss." Throughout the course of the second part of the day, multiple people were taken out class to be spoken to. It was a good ploy, he supposed. Don't let anyone know who the real leaders were while confusing the leaders as to who their rival was. He explained this to Aizawa when he sat down with him. "So you saw through it?" He nodded, watching his teacher's usual bland expression creep into his wide, logical ruse smile. "Good, you're already doing better than your rival is." He noticed the lack of pronouns but didn't bring it up, after all, just because he'd realized the ploy didn't mean all would be revealed to him. Besides, Mei had already let him know who his rival was. UA was nothing if not informative. "I want to ask a few things, Sensei, about the rules and parameters." "Of course, problem child. Let me explain the objectives first, though. Your main goal is to last the 7 days. He must have pulled a face because Aizawa's grin broadened. "Of course you're aware the test has never lasted that long. Your second way to win is to either kill the heroes or push them to a situation where surrendering is their only option. This time around, Nizu has added objectives to earn bonus points." He nodded, opening the notebook he'd placed on the table upon entering, and started to write it all down. The hero's main goal is to either push you to surrender or take you all captive. They themselves have goals to accomplish, namely taking your bonus points. You can reclaim bonus points from the heroes. He felt his mind whirling to life now. Hours spent thinking of plans to crush his classmates, hours that he had previously hated himself, were now coming to fruition. The bonus points would likely be objects if they could be retrieved and regained. However, they could just as easily be actions to accomplish. He'd have to add equipment permission slips to his list of things he'd need to obtain. The heroes won't know about their objectives until the day of the exam. This made him pause, and looking up at his teacher he saw nothing to indicate that he'd misheard. Is that because the villains have never won? If it was pity points, he'd take them. His advantage was he was underestimated. If this was because his team was underestimated, he wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. Yes and no. Aizawa looked like he wasn't going to elaborate for a few seconds, but he eventually continued. Yes, because as you've said, the villains have never won. In real life that wouldn't always be the case, but no at the same time. A sly look claimed his teacher's face, and he tried to remember if the last exam of this type had been on while his teacher had been a student. In a real-life situation like the one we're hoping to simulate, heroes wouldn't know what to do to take down the villains. He nodded, writing that extra information in all capitals. That would be important, especially if the reports were true about this being judged on realism. Your turn now, Midoriya. Flicking to his page of important questions, he tore it out of the book. The action caused Aizawa to raise a brow. Izuku ignored it as he moved to a clean page. He had a feeling he would need a lot of space to write the answers. I know how I win, but how do I lose? The grin became even wider, and normally tired eyes became alive. You're asking the right questions, good. He wrote the word loss on his page and got ready to bullet point. You lose if the heroes capture all of you, if you surrender, if you are unable to sustain your team, and you risk going into a health risk situation. There was a pause, and Izuku looked up, seeing that light turn vicious in his teacher's eyes. He would definitely need to see if his sensei had ever taken part in this exam. Or if you yourself are captured for longer than 10 hours. 10 hours? He started to write in capitals again. A villain being captured isn't the end. If you were to lose as soon as you got caught, you would be reckless. That was true. However, if it was treated realistically, you would have the opportunity to escape, an opportunity that would allow you to be logical in your encounters with the heroes. Second question, what's the limitations of involvement from outside the hero course and of the staff during the exam? He knew he was making it obvious that he'd read up on this from the specified questions, but he didn't care. It's open to the entire year, with the exemption of the management course. Though if a management student approaches you, you are allowed to accept them into your team. He went to ask the second part of his question again when Aizawa finished speaking. Once the exam starts, staff aren't allowed to get involved unless it's retrieving dead students, or if it's to deal with the aforementioned health risks. An idea entered his mind, one he usually would have squashed, but not this time. Would teachers step in if a supply was poisoned, to incapacitate, not kill, but there was access to an antidote and a non-contaminated supply available to the victims? No. If it was made known that there was an antidote and it was nothing worse than, say, food poisoning, I don't see why we would. The way his teacher eyed him made Izuku realize how horrible what he was suggesting was, but wasn't that the purpose of the exercise? Is there a limitation on what external equipment you can bring into the exam? He made a new subtitle, contraband, and made a table of allowed and not allowed. Weapons of all kinds are permitted, although anything more than rubber bullets or dull blades are not allowed. Killing your opponents is not allowed. He kept his eyes on his teacher as he wrote, taking in his features as the man's eyes showed brief understanding of what he might be planning. Support equipment for heroic and general studies students are permitted. Support course generally don't fight in these exercises, so there aren't any rules saying what they can and can't bring in. He felt a smile twitch at his lips at that. May would have a field day. It also meant that the side project she and Shinso had been working on could have its field test. What about transportation? I assume the training ground will have roads and subways, but what can students use? He sat there as Aizawa looked at him, really looked at him, as if it was the first time he'd seen him for who he was. As if this was the first time Aizawa had looked past the fanboy persona and was looking at it. Calculating monster. Maybe it was. He often felt like a monster with most of his own ideas, many of them giving him pause. He wasn't surprised that Aizawa was thrown. There aren't any rules regarding that, only that if you use something you have a license or a learner's permit for it. Izuku had his learner and he knew Mei had gotten her actual license not too long into the year, something all support students needed to get apparently because of the nature of their modular projects. He didn't know who else had theirs, but it wouldn't be too hard to get them from UA for the purpose of the exam. Fourth question. This and the next question would confirm some theories. Is there a means of production of food within the exam, or are the food supplies supplied all there is? The thrown look from Aizawa was gone, and pride seemed to replace it. Now that Aizawa knew he was prepared to do anything, he seemed to understand that Izuku would do anything. All the food it's believed you'll need will be in your safe houses. However, the city itself has food shops, grocers etc. You won't be given money to buy anything, though you'll have to steal it. Do the heroes get given money? If they didn't, he'd need to make sure he doubled his efforts to snatch Yayazora from them before it was too late. If they did, he'd still need to make sure he got to her first. No. You're supposed to be making this into a war zone. Niza figured it'd make it too easy if the heroes could just buy things. That worked in his favor. In desperation of the heroes would have to break their own morals to feed themselves. It would help demoralize them. I have 2 more questions, Sensei. He received an interested nod. He prided himself on the fact that from the first question Aizawa had seemed almost on the edge of his seat. 1. Is the water system for the bases linked to the city's main water supply, or is it independent? Linked. Another piece of a plan fell into place. Standing up, he bowed and thanked Aizawa before turning to leave. Midoriya, your last question? He stopped at the door and looked over his shoulder. You were a villain in this exercise, weren't you, sir? I was. Okay, thank you, Sensei. I'll return to class now. Midoriya, he paused. Why did you want to know that if you were so sure? It's in your eyes. He missed how his teacher's eyes widened as he was looking away from his face. You want things to change. Nowadays people don't want things to change unless it affects them. Growing up quirkless dash, he corrects himself instantly. Thinking I was quirkless, I seemed to be the only one that didn't like how quirkless were treated. And with this, he made eye contact. You understand how unfair this setup is and you want us to win. Once he returns to class, the next person is called out, but he keeps his eyes firmly in front of him. Making eye contact with Todoroki would seem suspicious, especially as he's going to pretend to sign up for the villain team. Nobody outside of his team had to know he was the leader. It would help. People's attention would be diverted trying to figure out if he was the leader or not, which would make it easier for some of the plans he was cooking up. He settled into his seat again, resisting the urge to look over to his teammates. He managed to keep his restless energy under wraps because that would spoil the surprise for everybody else, and he couldn't have that. Once they were released back to the doors, he held back in class, letting his classmates leave before he, Shoji, and Koda did. He'd need to get their numbers so that he could add them to the chat with Mei and Shinso. He noticed, however, that their trio weren't the only ones staying behind. It wasn't immediately obvious that they were intentionally staying behind, but the way that the 6 kept glancing his way was telling enough. You're all here for the same reason, I'm guessing? He didn't look over at them as he packed his bag, but the uneasiness that entered the air was an indication that they were and that they were nervous. Laughing, he turned, facing Shoji first. When I asked if you could draw up a list of possible candidates, I didn't expect this. The taller boy simply shrugged. Izuku felt he would quickly learn to read his expressions through his mask. I thought you'd appreciate the hard work being done for you. It was said so smugly that Izuku couldn't help the grin that spread across his face. Turning to face his classmates, he took in who had stayed. Ojiro, Hagakure, Jiro, Kaminari, Ashido, and Tis. Just who he needed. Yaoyorozu. The first 2 he had expected to stay on the hero team, so it was a nice surprise. Jiro he suspected wanted to stick close to people who wouldn't destroy her eardrums, and with Bakugo inevitably going to the hero side whether Todoroki was leader or not, the villain team was the best course of action. Yayazora was more than likely sticking to Jiro. However, the level look one that held the confidence she'd had before the sports festival he was receiving from her told him that she was here out of her own judgment. Kaminari and Ashido surprised him though. They weren't sheep, but the way they followed Bakugo around reminded him of the middle school lackeys the blonde had had. However, he did remember that the two were more open-minded than Bakugo. Kirishima wasn't narrow-minded, he was one track at a time. And in his head a hero student would probably never entertain the idea of being a villain. Okay. He surveyed his new teammates. They were all watching him with some form of anxiety, but not the kind that came with regret or telling a lie. All of them were sure in their decisions of being here. Let's exchange numbers then. I already have 2 more people on our team. Deku, you work fast. Was breathed out by Kaminari, who was looking at him with something akin to awe. He didn't let the tightness that came with that nickname enter his smile. Please, call me Izuku. We're going to be spending the next fortnight in ridiculously close quarters. Formalities don't really matter now. There seemed to be an ease then, at the friendly gesture of giving permission for a given name. It was something normal in this strange situation. I asked for Shuji and Koda to meet me now just to exchange numbers, but... He slung his bag on his back. If we all exchange numbers, I have a plan we can put into motion now. He received nods, and when phones started getting pulled out he grinned. It was day 2 officially of prep time, and so far he thought things were going well. He'd acquired 8 teammates and had gotten Mei and Yayazor working together on parts and costumes. Plus he'd gotten his other teammates to write lists of people they knew they could comfortably take on in combat and those they knew they couldn't. They'd texted their lists last night and he'd started cross-referencing so that he knew who he could afford to pair up depending on who showed up on the opposition's team. He was tired, but it wasn't too bad yet. Deku! Opening his dorm door, he was greeted by Uraraka, which despite her being his friend was not something he wanted to see first thing on a Saturday morning. He was too tired for her energy. Where's the fire? It was clearly a bit too snarky for his usual personality because she looked at him with a raised brow before seemingly deciding it wasn't worth it before continuing. Todoroki just came out and confirmed that he was the hero leader. We have to go sign up. He paused as she smiled brightly at him. He hadn't ever thought of asking her to join his team, but the insinuation that he would obviously go towards the team with a strong figurehead annoyed him a bit. The rest of the class had little to no knowledge of the villain team or leader. What if Bakugo was the leader? Or Ida? Didn't it occur to her to wait? See what both teams had to offer? It was earlier than he wanted to, but the way her grin was dimming the longer he stayed stationary in the doorway, he had to play his first card. I'm sorry, Uraraka, I can't. But what? I've already been recruited. She didn't seem to get it as her smile went full force again. Of course that makes sense. Why wouldn't Todoroki get you at the first available moment? No. He had to watch his realization smash through her rose-tinted glasses. Uraraka, I'm on the villain's team. W.I.? He'd expected surprise but not the anger in her voice. Why would you do that? He didn't understand the anger in her voice. What right did she have? She was his friend, not his mother. He realized how much this sounded and looked like a lover's spat. Both of them were in their pajamas, Izuku half-dressed in a pair of jogging pants and a back-to-front t-shirt, and Uraraka had obviously gone straight to him after hearing the news, probably sent by text, as was evident by her messy hair. Coupled with the fact Izuku was keeping himself upright through the use of the door frame and Uraraka being nearly in tears, it looked like he was breaking up with her after they'd spent the night together. God, this was going to get the rumor mill going, wasn't it? Uraraka, I did it because it's my choice. He grit his teeth in the adversity of her angry and betrayed expression. Hopefully she'd gossip about it to their other friends and he'd be left alone for the time being. Though at the same time that was an issue. If you don't like it, that's not my problem. You idiot. She turned on her heel then and stormed off. Now that she wasn't blocking the way, he can see his floor mates looking on in shock. Tokoyami and Aoyama especially seemed shocked. Mineta to his left looks like he's about to have an aneurysm. You spent the night with Uraraka? Are you effing deaf? The 3 boys freeze. She said that I'm not on the hero team. You're not on the hero team? It didn't take long apparently for it to spread that Todoroki was the hero leader. It didn't surprise him. He enjoyed the chaos that his class created about it really. It gave him cover. Thankfully the fact that he was on the villain team hadn't spread, though the way Uraraka kept glaring over at him, The cat would be let out of the bag sooner rather than later. Then there was Mineta to worry about, but the likelihood of anyone believing him meant that he wasn't a threat. However, he wouldn't throw his status as a threat away. He'd seen at the USJ and at the sports festival how potent his quirk could be. Out of sheer principle, he wouldn't have him on his team, so they would have to find a way to counter his quirk. May did still hold a grudge because of what the boy had done to her baby, so it would result in something most likely over the top but incredibly effective. He had spent most of the night, that wasn't filled with cross-referencing, planning different strategies for different scenarios for the bonus points. Looking through records, his assumptions that the bonus points were objects and actions were not unfounded, so he needed to come up with plans. He'd have to start having the team get together to train early if he wanted this to work. Risking a glance around the room, he made eye contact with Yayazoru, and when she nodded, he turned his head back to facing forward. When the lesson finished up, thankfully leading into lunch, he stood and began packing his bag. He'd need to show May the plans on his laptop as well as make sure that Yayazoru knew the plan. That then left him the awkward role of disturbing the delicate peace he and Monoma had formed between them. It would look suspicious whether he went to the dorms, though that could contain the issue. And still too much exposure due to proximity to his own dorms, or if he kidnapped his blonde friend? Before he went off for lunch. Midoriya. He didn't physically freeze, though everything in his mind besides core functions did. It was like the tabs for each plan had been minimized to hide from being scrutinized. Todoroki. He made eye contact, kept his posture relaxed if a bit skittish. The normal, and smiled. What's up? Uraraka said you were on the villain team. There were definitely a few gasps of shock. Well, ding, he thought, now the glares made sense. She was really vindictive at times, wasn't she? An uneasy silence settled over the room at the accusation. Was it even an accusation if it was true? And he realized how full the room was. He wasn't going to play his full hand yet, so, keeping in line with the anxious character he'd had them associate him with for so long, he spoke. It's true. More gasps and a quick glance around, disguised as a trapped animal looking for an escape look, revealed that his team was doing a very convincing job of playing the concerned classmate. What about it? The blank face of his friend didn't change. Heterochromic eyes unchanged by the news. It set him off a bit actually. Only the slight twist to his mouth betrayed him. Why? He didn't mean for it to happen, but he let out a Midoriya Izuku laugh. You're the second person to ask me that today. He refused to look at Uraraka from her place next to Todoroki. Because it's ridiculous to think you'd willingly go over to the villain team. He could see the cogs begin to turn in Todoroki's head and was about to pull some bullshit out of thin air when Yayazoru saved him. He joined because I asked him to. Even more gasp, what were they, a drama show now? Erupted, and he knew immediately that people thought that was Yayazoru coming out as the leader. I wanted to improve my quirk and figured the villain perspective would allow for that, and Izuku has been helping me with my quirk recently, so when I asked him he agreed. If a silence could choke, he'd have been dead times over. It was almost literally suffocating in the classroom. Izuku? Since when did you start calling him that? He wasn't sure who exactly said it, but it brought attention away from him being on the villain team. From the tone it sounded suspiciously like Ishido. The smirk he caught her wearing warranted a gift in return. What? He titled his head, classic Deku move, highlight the innocent features and ignore Bakugo's scoff. Momo's called me by my given name for a while now. It erupted into chaos from there, and he was glad he'd texted his other teammates what had to be done before class had ended because he and Yayazoru were bound to be preoccupied for a while now. Finally escaping, he was quick to check his phone, seeing the group chat filled with progress reports. Recon was a go. We're being tailed. He'd noticed the reflection in his phone as he'd turned it off, the distinctive forms of his friends a few paces behind. They weren't hard to pick up on, too loud for this kind of thing. Yayazoru nodded, giggling like he'd told a particularly funny joke. Shall we head for lunch then? She leaned in closer than she normally would have. He had to give it to her. She was a convincing actress. May's 10 minutes? Her eyes answered yes, and he pulled away from her with a bright, cheery smile. See you there, Momo. He called as they reached the staircase. They were lucky that the staircase split into two different directions, or otherwise it would have resulted in a chase through the corridors. Turning, they went down different staircases, apparently going in opposite directions, and Izuku smirked to himself as he took 3 steps at a time, resisting the urge to take the banister just barely. When he got to the bottom of the single flight and onto the second floor, he hid under the stairs and watched as Tsuyu and Todoroki made it to the bottom of the stairs, looking left then right before splitting up in search of him. He stayed crouched for a few seconds longer after they'd left, just long enough so that he couldn't see them anymore. After that he stood up, texted Yaoyorozu that he was on the move and drifted back up the stairs he'd just come down. He took this trip up at a casual pace. He didn't want to risk Ida and Uraraka hearing him if they were near the top of the stairs. Making it to the landing, he went the way he'd just come, drifting past his classroom to see nobody but Aizawa inside, and made it to 1B. Hopefully Monoma had lunch in the room. Looking inside, he was greeted with the sight of Vlad King looking up from, oh god. Izuku wanted to take pictures, but that would get him in trouble. A cutesy bento box, Monoma and Yanagi Reiko having a quirk-off, and Tokage experimenting with her hand on the ceiling. It was what 1A would look like if they were wholesome and weren't all a pack of rabid animals. Izuku included himself in that grouping. Midoriya. Vlad King looked like he wanted to say something, but seemed to understand that the bento box was probably not something that gained him respect. I'm here for Monoma, sir. There was a pause, and Monoma seemed to peek his prideful self out of its shell. What do you want, 1A scum? To his surprise, it was the Yanagi girl who hit him on the back of the neck with the signature karate chop Kendo was so commonly seen executing. Please, you don't ever shut up about how much you enjoy hanging out with him and the other two. The sad-looking girl smiled as best as she apparently could. Take him, please don't give him back. He cracked a smile, and the one being sent his way turned a bit more genuine. Come on, Monoma. He strolled towards the downed boy, grabbing onto the back of his blazer. May has new gadgets for you to try. The blonde made some noise of confirmation and didn't object as he started to drag him down the hall by the back of his blazer. Nobody stopped them as they exited the classroom. As they made their way down the hall, he got out his phone as he dragged Monoma with one hand. Gonna be a few minutes late. Had to detour. He typed quickly, keeping the chat open just in case Yaoyorozu had the phone in her hand. Midoriya? Looking up from his phone. He looked up and saw Midnight standing in the corridor, a look of concern flitting across her face. He realized how bad the scene looked. Him, dragging a slightly dazed Monoma by the back of the blazer with one hand while he avidly texted someone with a grin on his face. There was clearly only one way to deal with this. Hi sensei, how are you today? He stopped in the corridor to face her, and the woman smiled with tight eyes. I'm fine, Midoriya. What you got there? A smoothie. He made his smile wider. May wants Monoma and I to be her test subjects. Her eyes looked even more dazed. Vlad King sensei is okay with this, by the way. Yanagi knocked him out because he was being a little beach. She mutely nodded at him. Say that to my face, Midoriya. He slurred, and he did his best to haze her with bright smiles and innocent eyes. We gotta go now, sensei. Have a nice day. Slipping his phone into his pocket, he picked up the blonde and threw him over his shoulder as he approached the stairs. Bye, Midoriya. We clearly have different ideas of what a detour is, boss. Dropping Monoma atop of Shinsu's half-conscious form, he let out a laugh at the loud noise of confusion and embarrassment behind him. Not really. He jumped up onto the empty spot on the work desk May reserved for him and looked out at one potential squad of his team. Monoma and Shinso were rearranging themselves on the sofa to look slightly dignified. Yaoyorozu was perched on a chair he hadn't seen before, as elegant as ever, and May was next to him, back pressed into his thigh as she sat on her stool with her laptop in her lap. I think they're exactly the same. The pinkette tilted her head back until it was resting on his leg and gave him a scrutinizing look that he returned with a crooked grin. Whatever, I get Blondie out of it, so I'm not complaining. Speaking of which... Monoma's complaint was accompanied with a slight grunt from Shinso as the couch was jostled. Why the hell did you drag me along the effing corridor? Izuku, you did what? He looked away from where both Shinosu and Yaoyorozu were staring at him in shock. He could see the humor in Shinso's eyes, but he didn't know how long he could last not laughing, and Yaoyorozu didn't look too happy. He was barely conscious, okay? I'm built like a stack of bricks, but I'm not a DMN pack mule. I wasn't going to carry him down 2 halls and down the stairs. That wasn't even the worst of it. His friend settled back into the couch and slumped into the material. At least 4 teachers saw us and none of them even bothered to question it. Incorrect. His grin got bigger as Monoma's eyes widened and the other 3 got on the edge of their seats. Midnight Sensei stopped us before letting me on my way. You told me to say you got knocked out by Yanagi to your face. There was a groan of despair from the blonde before Mei got them back on the right lines. You said you wanted us to start working on something, right? Yeah. But first, Monoma. The boy looked Dover, resigned to whatever sheet he was going to drag him into this time. Want to be on the villain team? Whatever. I'll be on the end of Mei's babies anyway. I'd rather be pulling the trigger than in front of the barrel. That, ironically, leads to the topic of today. Weapons. There was a loud shout of laughter and, concerned that sleep deprivation had finally caused Shinso to snap, he made to get off of the bench and go over to him. Monoma made a quick escape from the couch. Shinso? You're letting Mei make weapons? We're all effing screwed. After the lunch debrief, he and Yayazor, they decided to just roll with calling each other Momo, and Izuku left Mei's lab separately as they made their way to class. Izuku made sure to bump into his teammates on the way through the corridors. If he was past slips of paper or memory sticks in the past, nobody needed to know. Arriving back to the classroom first, he felt slightly at odds when Tokoyami and Aoyama ganged up on him in the doorway. Midoriya, we want to dash. Hearing their other classmates coming down the corridor, he cut the bird-headed boy off. Both of you, the gym for PM. They looked shocked but nodded, and when the rest of the class came in, it was to see Aoyama and Tokoyami discussing what constituted too much sparkle and him reading a book. Aizawa was a few minutes late, but he didn't care. All that he was focused on was the new contacts added to the group chat, courtesy of Monoma. As this is the week leading up to the exam, we would normally allow the 2 teams to go recruit and train in these last few PRDS of the day. Aizawa looked out over all of them. However, due to the fact the villain leader is exercising their right to remain anonymous, we can't do that to its full extent. Todoroki raised a hand. Sir, why is it that the villain leader had the right to remain anonymous? To improve realism. Consider it a part of the experience, Todoroki. Any other questions before I get the lesson started? He went to raise his hand, but Hagakure did it first. Sensei, the villain team leader may not have come out and said who they were, but there are those of us who have already registered with the teachers. A tense quiet settled over the room. Oh? The invisible girl stood up, and despite the fact that he couldn't see anything but her uniform, he could hazard a guess at the fact that she was holding her head high. Yes, Sensei. I myself have already registered my place on the villain team with Snipe Sensei. Same here, Sensei. He raised his hand, and in a few seconds the rest of his team, including Aoyama and Tokoyami, Koda, raised their hands. Our captain sent a message as well at lunch. We have 1B teammates as well. It'd be beneficial if we could meet and discuss. Aizawa watched them. He noticed his eyes never lingered on any one of them for any particular amount of time. I'll inform Vlad King that you're coming to collect your teammates, then proceed to support lab. That will be your headquarters for now. He hid his grin at hearing the lab number. It seemed the staff were quick to figure out his Rouge teammates. At least Mei got to keep her lab set up. Mei, I've not done programming for a while. What's the first basic rule? He sat next to her on the workshop bench. His team stood there watching him and his friend, realizing the pieces of late-night talks and scraps of overheard plans finally falling into place in her head, crossed her face. You cheeky bastard. She laughed hysterically after her comment, mad glee overtaking. First basic rule of programming. Assume all users are stupid and plan everything around that. Aren't we underestimating our opponents? No. We're just planning from the ground up. He smiled at the questioning looks. Most of the heroes are tacticians but not team players. They'll have impressive plans, but idiotic slip-ups will lead to failure if exploited correctly. Not that I don't think this is great and all. It's one of the 1B kids that Monoma brought along. His name was Aways if he remembers right, but how exactly is this group going to take down the rest of the heroics department? It's a simple enough question. Curiosity and rightful concern fill his voice, and Izuku watches as the kid waves his hands about being careful not to touch any of the metal on the walls in Mei's lab. Raw fire power doesn't win a war. But neither does strategy alone. We need a fine balance of both, which is where everybody here comes in. He can see he has their attention now, and from his spot on Mei's desk he leans forward a bit more. I had Monoma gather people from 1B that wanted to prove themselves. There's a downtrodden tinge to the way they hold themselves after that, because people who want to prove themselves are the most dangerous. He doesn't need to see them to know he has their attention, and looking out at his team, sans one person, he can tell they're all prepared to listen. As I'm sure you know, Todoroki Shudo is the hero team leader. Now, I'm not being offensive to anyone here. The look in Monoma's eyes screams of pain for him if he says the wrong thing, but pretty much everyone here isn't on his threat radar. As expected, the 1B students erupt into a state of anger. Surprisingly enough, his blonde friend, and Yanagi, though he hasn't seen her express much of anything, is the one to stay calm. But shut up and let Izuku finish, damn it, he's not here to brag. He feels his own mouth fall open at the use of his given name, but it works, and he has to continue speaking because his friend is beginning to look smug. Like I said, I'm not being offensive. I'm stating a fact. Todoroki Shudo doesn't consider most of the people in this room a threat. Whether that's him not seeing the versatility of your quirks or he's never fought you. He does a quick head count. 5 people in this room have fought Todoroki. He motions to himself. Hagakure, Ojiro, Momo and Juzo from 1B. Shinso isn't here, but Todoroki knows his abilities, and with a liability like Bakugu on his team, Shinso will be a threat. A general studies student? Wouldn't he just slow us down? He hasn't got the training with his quirk that we have. He wasn't sure exactly who said it, but it made his blood boil. Wouldn't I just slow you down then as well? He grits his teeth. Considering that I don't have full control of my quirk, and for the first 15 years of living I was perceived as quirkless? Everyone but Mei and Monoma stare at him, shocked perhaps? Disgusted? He isn't sure, but he takes a remote off of Mei's desk and uses it to turn on the old and dying projector that croaks to life before displaying a PowerPoint. Removing himself from the desk, he ignores the way they're looking at him. He isn't here for them to pity, he's here to lead them. I can match him punch for punch in firepower. Doesn't mean I can outright beat him though. He shrugs, just means I can slug him a few times before we both pass out. He turns back to his team, seeing that their resolve isn't gone, only changed. If you have regrets now, leave. If you can't deal with the training I'm going to put you through, leave. If you can't work with the people here, leave. Nobody goes. If you don't think that a general studies student is capable of being in this group, leave. And nobody leaves. Perfect. I'll explain the plan for this week then. They're taking a break from training. Quirkless combat was harder for quite a few of his teammates, but that was why they were handling it in the early stages. Why isn't Koji here? I noticed he wasn't with us before. Espionage is his simple response. Isn't it against the rules to switch sides during the exam? Mezu leans in his direction, mask pulled down slightly to allow for him to chug from his water bottle. He smiles, smirks really, a full-blown teeth-showing smile, and sees Denki and Rikido shift where they're sat. Not against the rules if his allegiances are with us the entire time. There's no rule against occupying an enemy camp and spying. Why do I feel? He looks to his left at the gasped-out words and sees Sun sprawled on the floor. That like my joints are going to pop off? Same. Rises up from a few others in the group. His smile devolves from its smirk state into a genuine smile, and he pulls himself to his feet with minimal struggle. He's tired, yes, but training for UA was harder than this. Where did you even come up with this training regime anyway, Izuku? It's so strange to have so many using his first name, but it was him who told people they could, and when he looks at the voice, it's Toru. It's an easier version of what I did for the UA entrance exam. What? Really? The invisible girl pulls herself to her feet, renewed with energy now that her interest has been piqued. She stands in front of him in seconds. If this is easier, what did you do? He can hear the murmurs of agreement, and people start asking him to tell. He would, but it's embarrassing. Hey, Izuku. Yeah, Hitsuhai dash. He freezes as his friend sends him a grin and there's a short silence where everyone looks from Hitoshi to him. He's worried people are going to say something, but thankfully and rather not all at the same time, they all start to wear the same smug grin. Could you please tell us what your UA training was? It's worded so innocently and he can't help but find it a bit funny as he starts speaking without much control of what's coming out. He just manages to keep the All Might secret. I ran 2 miles every day, twice a day. Did 2 hours of taekwondo every other night and helped clean Dagoba Beach until it was clear again. He feels the familiar snap as Hitoshi's quirk releases him and stands there as his team stares. Reiko speaks first, impressive. And then all hell breaks loose. You did what? What kind of beast were you? He chuckles, looking away from the crowd. How would they react if he told them it was before his quirk came in as well? They continue to question him and well, he's just really happy that people want to know him. That people are willingly including him in social circles that had previously been barred to him. The team is a hodgepodge of social groups, and yet they seem to meld together near perfectly. He can already see there will be a few bumps before the exam starts, but that's why they're starting early after all. Alright, if you've got so much energy, let's continue. There are groans, whines of complaint, but still everybody gets up. He notices that nobody stops smiling either. Getting back to the dorm 3 hours after classes officially ended, Izuku and the 1A portion of his team were greeted with a very somber atmosphere. It had been made clear in class where people's loyalties pay when Aizawa had made the option for anyone who wanted to sign up for the villain team to go and do so. They'd acquired quite a good chunk of the class, or at least in 1A, but still, there was a percentage of the class that hadn't taken kindly to the villainous choice. Hey guys! Ever the optimists of the class, Mina and Denki remained unperturbed by the near-literal cold shoulder of their classmates. It caused the rest of the team to pause, the way the room had suddenly shut off all conversations the second they all entered the common room was suspicious to say the least. A quick glance at Koji told him this was intentional. Sorry dude, it was Kirishima who broke the silence. His sympathetic look a contrast to the grave and contemptuous looks from the others. We're on orders to not talk to you guys. He spared a look over to where Todoroki was sitting. Uraraka and Ida were hunched around a table with him. Bakugo wasn't too far away from the table, body language suggesting that whatever was going on over there was important and the blonde was a part of it. The heroes have a war council. Interesting. I'm heading off to bed, see you guys tomorrow. He raised a hand goodbye, addressing the whole room like everything was normal as he turned for the stairs. He turned his head though, before entering the stairwell and didn't try to hide his smirk. Don't forget what the boss said. There were confused looks spread around the heroes. Todoroki flinched ever so slightly, and his friends and teammates all grinned like they were in on a joke. He hadn't said anything for them to remember. It was a ploy to wind up the hero team. And it was working. He'd been in his dorm for about 10 minutes, maybe 15, when a knock rang out from the other side. Closing his laptop lid, he left it out in the open. No need to look suspicious if he didn't have to. He opened his door a fraction and frowned when he saw who was there. Todoroki, Uraraka and Ida were all standing outside his door, having the nerve to look conspiratorial. Deku, can we come in? Reluctant, but interested in what they wanted, he opened his door enough for them to see his face properly. Why are you here? We want to talk, Midoriya. He must make a face because Ida is quick to elaborate. It won't take long, we just wish to pose a few questions to you. Now this is really going to be interesting, isn't it? He finds himself thinking. Uraraka's fidgeting makes that much obvious when he opens his door enough for them to come in. His room at home had practically been an all-might shrine. Posters, memorabilia, pop figures, etc. He'd had everything to prove his status as a hero fanboy, but when he was presented with moving into the dorms, he'd had to seriously reassess his decorative choices. He'd a revaluation of sorts. Fanboying was fine, but shrine level was just weird. After that had been presented to his mind, he'd started how obsessive his hero collections were. He'd talked it through with his mother at that point, going through what he guessed was a midlife crisis. She'd informed him that throughout his life he'd had various phases where he focused on one thing and one thing only. With that in mind, he'd looked back and depressingly realized she was, In fact, correct. After that he'd gone through a purge of sorts. If it wasn't at least semi-functional, then it wasn't going to the dorms with him. He had at most 3 purely decorative items in his new room. A picture of him and his mother, glow-in-the-dark star stickers, and an inspirational quotes poster that his Aunt Mitsuki had gifted him that year for his birthday. Just because he and Bakugo didn't get along didn't mean he and his aunt didn't. His all-might memorabilia was stored in his room back home, awaiting his return if he ever so desired to relive the oblivious first 15 years of his life. His new room was remarkably plain in comparison, really. A twin bed shoved against the far right corner with flat tone covers. A desk was opposite that, cluttered with notebooks, school books, and analysis alike, and his laptop, which contained the only blatant hero merch in his room in the form of a menagerie of stickers. On the right side of the desk was a small collection of weights. At the foot of the bed rested a bean bag, and next to that was a bookshelf that was home to his textbooks, extensive literature collection, and the occasional manga here and there. He'd die before he admitted it, but he actually had really cutesy shoujo manga because hey, sometimes you just want to sit there and cry about friendship and love triangles. It wasn't like he was the only one. Stepping aside for them to enter, he saw them take a quick glance around his room and quickly take seats around the room while he remained standing. All right, your questions? He felt the overriding urge to keep his eye on Todoroki, who was closest to his laptop, but that would drag attention to the device, and all he needed was for his rival leader to discover his plans. Not after the past 2 sleepless nights. We want to say sorry first. That made him pause, a variable he wasn't expecting. In the past, when people had lashed out, he just had to roll with it. Uraraka stands from where she'd perched herself on the edge of the bed. Her movements are stiff like Ida's were the first few weeks of term. She bows to him, a formal way of apology that he doesn't quite understand why he's receiving. He becomes even more confused when she stays bowed and Todoroki from where he's sat at his desk and bows also. When they're both bowed is when Todoroki speaks. We apologize for calling you out this morning. The intention was not to make you feel cornered as it obviously made you feel. Uraraka picks up where he left off. I apologize for this morning as well. I overreacted and I should have respected your decision. I'm sure you had your reasons. He'd been well on his way to accepting the apology, but it's the wording at the end that throws him. Ida's twitch at the phrasing tells him he's also not the only one to notice something amiss. Then he remembers the fact that he's looking at 3/4 of the hero team's war council and alarm bells start ringing. He's fallen into one of his own traps. They shouldn't be in his room. What if they've figured, no. That's paranoia. Paranoia will get him nowhere. Breath Midoriya. But he thinks, calm now. Probably. Had my reasons? What's that supposed to mean? This is meant to be their time to ask questions, and it seems he's the one doing most of the asking. He doesn't like how much power that gives them. But then he takes another deep breath and realizes that that power will make them loose-lipped. This is a group of friends. He'd slipped his guard and he was probably more paranoid than Todoroki, so he just needed to needle in such a way that he'd get exactly what he wanted out of them. We have an offer. The way they seem to relax, Uraraka and Todoroki returning to their claimed chairs, gives him another image of a war council. They think they're working on home turf with no clue that they're in the lion's den. He shoves his hands into his hoodie pockets. He'd had his audio app open anyway. He knows how to press play without looking by now, and he does so before they notice. An offer. He keeps his hand in his pocket and shifts his footing. More relaxed, more open to suggestions. It's a familiar stance. We want you to be our spy on the villain team. The little tributes of information come together like a poorly stitched patchwork. He can see the reasons behind some of their earlier actions, but he's not displayed that level of intuition or cunning before, so he plays dumb. For now at least, he can't have them know what he knows. What? But you were really adamant about, and earlier. Turn to mumbling, lower head and cross arms while grasping chin. Lower volume and add a confused tone. He hears a good-natured huff of amusement from his 3 enemies and knows he's got them fooled. Deku. Do not flinch. Do not. This isn't junior high. They won't tell you to stop and shut up. Get a grip, Midoriya. Do not flinch. It's the cold, monotonous tone that Todoroki is known for that sparks an old memory, but he puts it away. Thankfully the pause in his mumbling plays into the act well. Looking up the rival leader is giving him a rare smile. He doesn't feel an ounce of guilt at playing them for fools. The reason we were so adamant about having everyone know you were on the villain team is because that way you wouldn't need to prove your loyalty to that group. Solid reasoning, he'll admit. But do they not realize the drawbacks? Now the hero team would be less likely to believe any information he would hypothetically give them. He finds irony in the fact that his rival is asking him to snitch on himself. I'm registered on the villain team. I can't switch or work for you. Not true, but if he's right then none of them will have read the rule book as deeply as he has, and Aizawa's wording had made it seem like Todoroki hadn't questioned things to a great degree, so he should be covering bases well on that end. The drooping of smiles and the way Todoroki's mismatched eyes lose a bit of their spark prove him right. If I could I would, but you know me, a fake little laugh gets them relaxed and makes sure they don't question the next few words. I've read it cover to cover. There isn't a way for something like that to work. He likes to think he can read Todoroki pretty well, and he's thankful for that because it allows him to see the tension melt from his shoulders because why would he lie to them? He was Midoriya Izuku, he didn't lie to his friends. He smiles at them as they say they need to go after a few more minutes of mindless chatter. As they leave the room he proves to himself that he can do this. That he can truly and fully deceive his friends and let his thoughts come to fruition. He lies directly to their faces and looks them in the eye. By the way, I don't know who the leader of the villains is. I joined because of Momo, but to be honest, laugh and look to the side, I don't know who my boss is. No one really took charge. Good, he thinks as the gears turn behind their eyes. Let them think the villains aren't unified. Nobody plans well for a rabble. Proper plan for armies, people improvise for rambles. He'd have Koji keep him updated though. Uraraka looks at him in shock. Really? Wow, they're really keeping the anonymous thing going, aren't they? Todoroki pauses outside his room and he doesn't let his emotions betray the worry at being called out that constricts his throat. Is it possible that Yayazoru is the leader? It isn't aimed at anyone in particular. Your guess is as good as mine. Good night. They bid him good night and he locks the door behind them. Strolling to his desk he pulls out the phone and ends the audio. He places the phone on the desk and waits a good 10 minutes while typing before daring to go over to his door. He checks through the gap between the door and the doorway to make sure no one is hiding away and watching. Sure that the only one possibly listening in is Dark Shadow next door, he replays the audio and smirks when the entire conversation is caught. It's a bit muffled, yes, but it's clear enough that there aren't any misconceptions to be had about what's being said. Opening the group chat he sends the file. Kumicho, look who visited me. MP3. There's a lull where he leaves his phone on his desk as he goes about getting changed for bed. It's Sunday tomorrow, so he won't need to make appearances unless necessary until the afternoon. He wanders around rearranging things here and there as the phone on the desk pings with an instance. Going back over to it, he smirks as he has to scroll up to read the responses. Wakagashira, wow, I knew they'd thrown you under the bus, but wow. Piper, we're lucky he doesn't suspect anything, but that makes my job easier. Cleaner, I didn't know you were such a good actor, your voice doesn't even have a trace of hesitation. Evangelion, I take it that this is my cue to tap their phones. Wakagashira, don't get caught. Evangelion, who do you think you're talking to? Weindersker, this is what I mean by 1A being cocky. Shadow, I'll chop you again. Muscle, so that was where he went today. More messages popped up and he scrolled down to read through them as they appeared. He put his phone down though, opening up his laptop again, the screen turning back on to display the blueprints and plan view of Ground Gamma. He brought up another tab, MS Paint of all things, and traced another route over the map in the tab for another heist plan. Nizu had sent him an email with all the things they would need to acquire or commit for their bonus points, and he was planning the routes. Another round of pings drew his attention and he saved his current progress before turning his attention towards his phone again. At Kumicho. Ninja, why are we getting Kumicho's attention? Mirror, it's important, just help. At Kumicho. Ninja, alright? At Kumicho, hurry before she blows up your phone. Eldritch at Kumicho. Demo man at Kumicho. Demo woman at Kumicho. Nova at Kumicho. Thunderstormol at Kumicho. Torch at Kumicho. Addict, F4 at Kumicho, S-phone. Zombie, why are we all at Kumicho? Geo, humor at Kumicho. Blanc, to reach the pinnacle of comedy. At Kumicho. Hephaestus, you should stop now. Have you considered that Kumicho is busy? Apollo, sorry mum. Kumicho, I'm purposefully ignoring all of you by the way. Except you Hephaestus, we're honored you're here with us. Mirror. At Kumicho, what do you think of this plan? We bedazzle Todoroki. Kumicho is typing. He snorted at the idea, his mind's eye trying to visualize it. He could already feel his mind trying to find ways to make that work. Kumicho. I'll see what I can do. Hephaestus at Kumicho. Wakagashira, look who's in trouble. Evangelion, look who's in trouble. Hephaestus at Wakagashira at Evangelion. Kumicho, look who's in trouble now. Hephaestus at Kumicho, open up, I just want to talk. Kumicho, sheet, Momo, I'm sorry, how the hell did you get to my room so quick? Hephaestus, like I said, I only want to talk. Kumicho, if I don't make sure my funeral is open casket and have Bakugu lower me down. Putting his phone away and once again closing the lid of his laptop, he went over to his door to find it was in fact Momo standing at his door, but he smiled at her anyway. Despite how scared he was that she might actually do him in and ascend to the head of the villain crew. You wanted to talk about my quirk? Yeah, come on in. This might be a long chat. If either had bothered to look at their phones, they would have noticed the flood of responses. Eldritch can confirm that at Hephaestus is in fact coming for at Kumicho. We'll update when the sounds of murder start. Apollo of Nova Piper, F chapter text. What's the extent of your quirk's abilities? Reaching out to one of the notebooks on the table, he was glad to have grabbed the right one. Clicking a pen, this time having been behind his ear, he got ready to write. What do you mean by extent? Like, he took a seat at his desk chair and Momo perched on his bed. How much can you make in one go? What can't you make? Can you control what you make if the original object was sentient? She sat staring at him, and Izuku could tell she was trying to judge how serious he was being about this. Her expression turned contemplative. I must admit I've never actually tried to make anything living. What did you have in mind? Bacteria? Viruses? There's a few tense moments where he can see Momo really looking at him. It's the same way that Aizawa looked at him. Like she's just now seeing the kind of monster he can be if he really wants to be. She stares into the eyes of the beast, and she is not the first to look away. I can try. That's all I ask. He shifts in his seat and sighs. I understand that I'm effectively asking you to poison our classmates, but... He pauses, looking away. He isn't trying to manipulate here. He just doesn't know how to get across the fact that since he could understand the difference between right and wrong, his brain has always wanted to do the bad thing. Bullying? Well, learn their weaknesses and exploit them. Wreck them before they wreck you. Need to work around a problem? Tear the problem to the ground so it's never a problem again. Injured? Find a way to make the attacker look worse. Want people to ignore you? Manipulate them and their whole view of you. It's the way your mind works, isn't it, Izuku? He looks up at her, seeing no judgment. I could tell from the way you just settled into this role. You like to be able to control things and to be able to plan. But at the same time, I can tell you're also not above improvisation and rolling with the punches. It's why having a request like that isn't too strange. A smile spreads across her face and he thinks to himself that she looks better relaxed. It's a novel thought, really. It comes with the territory of having nearly zero control of any aspect of your life, I guess. They're getting off topic, but she doesn't mention it, so he continues. Did you know when I was 7 my sensei told me that I needed to start planning my career before I reached the age of 11? Oh, they sound like an interesting sensei. He chuckled at that sensei had been the only one to ever be kind to him, to not care about his quirklessness and to actually treat him like every other kid. Yeah. Sensei was amazing. But the reason he told me to start looking for a job at the age of 7 was because the unemployment percentage of the entire population is 95% quirkless. Her bemused expression drops, and her mouth twists. Why? Why isn't it on the news? Why is it that big percentage? Why don't people care? There are so many whys she can ask. Why did it ever get to such a high percentage? He realizes he could be manipulating her, subconsciously, and decides to ignore that thought. You know the quirk discrimination laws, the ones that have been around since quirks first came in? She nods. They haven't been changed in nearly 200 years. There aren't any laws about discriminating against the quirkless. The government likes to pretend they don't exist. He realizes his slip-up. Sometimes he forgets that he's only here because of All Might's quirk. But then he remembers, and all he can think about is that younger him would be so upset and angry. He never did become a quirkless hero. He's just like everybody else now. Once the quirk came in, he decided that the quirklessness didn't matter. He was past it. But that's wrong, he is quirkless. He doesn't have the gene or the lack of a joint in his toe. Biologically, he is quirkless. He's merely a container for one for all. He makes sure to remind himself of that often. He can see it in All Might's eyes that the man had gotten so used to not being quirkless anymore that the prospect of it is scary to him. That's why he reminds himself often, because he never wants to wake up one morning and realize he's dreading the day he goes back to being him. Deku is the boy with a quirk. Izuku is the kid who learned to work around the world. I suppose, she begins, body folded over slightly and a hand on her chin, that I can understand then why it is that you immediately go for the way to put the situation in your favor. Bakugo. The way he treats you. She leaves it open-ended. It's the same way he used to treat me when he thought I was quirkless. Her lips thin at the confirmation. I'll admit, when I first met you I was skeptical that you would make it. Well, that hurt more than he thought it ever would. He was sure he'd gotten used to that kind of reaction by now. You were anxious, shaking, and had absolutely no control over your quirk. Now though, I can see beyond that. He feels a small little smile slide onto his features. We were all anxious that day. You however were trying to control a quirk that holds more power than most of us combined do, and you had the knowledge that a childhood bully was watching your every move. She laughs sullenly to herself. Thinking back, it was rather hypocritical of me to see you that way. That's not important now though, is it? She claps her hands together and like that they're back on track. He's glad he has someone like Momo in his inner sanctum. No. I ask about your quirk because yesterday while we were watching May plan our deaths, I had some of our other teammates do recon. She leans forward on the bed, elbows resting on knees, and her expression turns, dare he say it, downright conniving. Oh yes, he smirks. Denki short circuits a lot, right? Well, he spent lunch today learning how machines output electricity and excess energy. He's got an appointment with Power Loader tomorrow for some support equipment. He closes the log-forgotten notebook. Toru and Mashareo were skulking around 1B's lunch spot. The whole class mainly sits together at lunch apparently. I've now got data on basic mutant quirks in that class. He starts to list the operatives off on his fingers. Koji was sitting with the hero team. He's got data on their movements and training. We'll be using that to change our training accordingly. Mina and Jiro spent time going through the different uses of their quirks. I'll get back to that in a minute. Sato spent lunch researching some foods I asked him to look into. At her look he elaborated. From what I could get out of Aizawa, a problem we'll face is food shortages. I was hoping to make nutritious foods with as little waste as possible for our endeavor. I had Shoji ask around about what kind of things we can bring into the exam, which brings me back to Mina. He could feel his grin widen. Diluted acid conducts electricity and we have both acid and electricity, so tomorrow I'm having the two of them go to May so the three of them can figure that out. She nodded along, eyes becoming more approving the further he went on. I was wondering if you and Nito could go with them tomorrow. Of course I can go. Though Nito I'm not too sure. He's fine once you get used to him, promise? But the reason I'd like you to go is because that way you can prompt May into saying whether or not she got permission for the bacteria I want you to replicate. Out of curiosity, she leant back. He spared a quick glance to the clock to see nearly an hour had passed. What exactly does this bacteria do? Think of a waterborne version of food poisoning. However, this strain is particularly nasty. It makes the victim nauseous and causes them to pass out for anywhere between 2 to 16 hours. Her mouth fell open. It was originally created by the government as an interrogation drag, but it was deemed against human rights to use it. Especially when sometimes in these interrogations they'd pump them to high heavens with the drag and kill the suspect. And you want me to make this because? No, never mind that. How do you know about this? How has May gotten her hands on it? Now you're asking the real questions. Simply, the drag became public knowledge a few years back, but the media didn't cover it in case of any big scandals coming to light. He shrugged. Yue has a stash of it though. Despite the whole human rights thing, the head before Nizu thought it would be good to use to restrain defiant students. He can see the disgust enter her features. I'm quoting the guy himself here. Those were his words about the decision to hold samples of it. How I came to learn about it, however, is that Recovery Girl didn't realize I'd woken up after my surgery at the sports festival and I just started asking about the stuff on the walls. And you're having May get clearance for this, and having me and potentially Nito replicate this because? He doesn't know what expression he makes, but it must not be very nice. Aizawa turned around and said the heroes wouldn't step in unless there was no out for the heroes. So, we're going to push them to an out by damaging one of their previous resources. You want to infect the water supply. Bases are on different water lines to the rest of the city. If we hit just the hero base and leave everywhere else safe, the heroes won't step in. And if we have an antidote. Understanding settled in. You want us making an antidote, not the actual drag. Correct. Glancing up from where he was trying to memorize the layout of the main base, he saw the clock reading 2 in the morning. Groaning, he pulled himself out of his chair and landed on the bed with a thud. He was too tired for this. Lying on the bed, he closed his eyes, trying to go to sleep. His mind, however, wasn't having it. And thoughts he'd need to privately address popped up. He'd told Momo earlier that the base's water supply was separate, but Aizawa had said they were linked. That meant he'd need to find some way to separate the water supply or potentially block off the villains and poison the rest? No, that wouldn't work. He didn't want to put any more pressure on May than he already was. That's why he was having Nito helping Momo, who was helping the inventor. Then there was the issue of costumes. Functionality and aesthetic would need to be balanced here. Again, the only way for them to be made would be through the use of the previous trio. Unless. Scrambling out of bed, he picked up his phone and opened his emails. Aizawa had said he couldn't directly involve management in combat, however he didn't say he couldn't do supply gathering through. He was just lucky some management course had given them his email for business dealings in the present or in the future. He'd have to pull favors out for this. However, he could make a deal out of this. They worked with the management course, and whatever modular fake businesses they were running, they could stick sponsors around the exercise. His grin reappeared as he typed out his proposal. If they could get their hands on material and flexible, not too bulky armor, he'd register himself and the villain team as fake sponsors and use the training ground as a giant advertisement show. Wait, that could help as well with the realism aspect. After all, how many facades and fake companies existed for the sole purpose of a villain source of income? He finished composing his email and sent it, before placing his phone on the bedside table. He didn't lie back down now. Though one problem had been solved, he had another to solve. Looking at the clock on the wall, he cringed when he reminded himself what time it was. Maybe he could wait till morning? But by then there would be even less time to plan, and they were already on day 3 of 7 of planning and only losing more time. Screw it. He whispered under his breath as he picked the phone back up. It rang a few times before the groggy voice of his mother tentatively called out his name. Hey, Mama. He began to pace as her sleepy voice fretted over him. No. I'm fine, no I haven't been up all night. Alright, yes. But I have a favor to ask. Do you have Mr. Heideken's number? He laughed at her response. No, don't worry, I'm not planning on plumbing my own room. It's for that school project I told you about. He'd always wondered where he'd gotten his true nature from. After all, his mother was so sweet and innocent. However, hearing her guess his entire plan from just asking for a plumber's number made it abundantly obvious who he'd gotten it from. I know I won't go too far. I know I could have just texted you, but I just wanted confirmation that I could talk about it. Her softening voice soothed his nerves. So you'll text his number to me? That's great. I'll see you in a few weeks, okay, Mama? Love you too, bye. Costumes were potentially fixed. And now so was the plumbing, possibly. Production of weapons was something he'd be taking up with Mei, Momo and Nito later. His phone in his hand as he started pacing aging. Koji had let him know that the heroes were training in the mornings, so that meant he'd have to continue training at night so that they weren't caught out. But Koji was also supplying him with what exactly the heroes' training was like, which helped a great deal. He'd planted the seed earlier that the villains weren't united and he'd have to expand on that, otherwise it would come out as what it was, a cheap diversion tactic. He continued doing circuits of his room as plans and problems crashed down on him from all angles. It was a hell of a lot harder when people expected these kinds of things from him. That was it. Why the hell was he focusing so much on coming up with new plans when he already had an extensive collection of countermeasures that he could just improve upon? That slowed his pacing and the feeling of drowning lessened slightly. There was, however, one idea that he was very fixated on bringing to fruition. It was risky, possibly against the rules, though he hadn't found anything against it, and could very well get him in serious trouble. Principal Nizu was sure to love it. Content with his new plan of action, and that he had things to do tomorrow besides worry, he was finally able to put his phone on his desk and lie down. This time, when he turned off the lamp and closed his eyes, he actually slept. Izuku. He nodded at Rikido as he entered the kitchen. It was 5 am, meaning he'd only had 3 hours sleep, but he could handle that. He'd run on less before. Morning. What are you up to? He created small talk as he grabbed 2 bagels from the packet clearly labeled Bokogu Katsuki's and shoved them in the toaster. He caught sight of the smile on his teammate's face as he watched him. Trying out some new recipes, your mother's recommendations were excellent, by the way. That brought a smile to his lips as he busied himself with getting out a plate along with the butter. He usually had traditional breakfast, but he needed to be in and out quick today, so Western style it was. That's great. Oh. Taking the popped bagels, he started to butter them. I'm gonna be out for a while today. Do you mind helping Fumiko and Yugo with their plan? Sure. You sure you don't want more than just a bagel? He held up the 2 now buttered bagels. I have 2. Besides, he was already leaving the kitchen as he spoke. I have to be out early today. See you later. Bye. Making his way out of the dorms, scoffing one of the bagels, he met up with Hitoshi outside the front door. Handing off the second bagel, they made their way to the main school building. Thanks. But are you sure this is safe? Swallowing his current mouthful, he answered, Not at all. That's why I'm having you come with. You're registered as my second with Nizu anyway, you being there won't be too suspicious. Too suspicious? He grinned. Nizu is paranoid he's going to have looked at this requested meeting from every angel since I asked for it 2 days ago. That, half of a piece of bagel was motioned at him like an accusatory finger, is the worst decision you could possibly make, besides letting Mei make weapons. What? He smirked. Let the high specs figure me out? Nah, I think that's exactly the right decision to make. Nizu wouldn't let me get away with it if he didn't want to see how it'd play out. There was silence and he looked over to his best friend. I can't tell who's worse. You or Nizu? You're both viewing this like it's a game, which I guess it is, but what I want to know is. They stopped in front of the doors to the main building. Who are you playing against, Izuku? He stood there silent, not expecting the question. The answer was simple, wasn't it? He was playing against Todoroki and everyone on the hero team. But then he thought about it, truly thought about. He thought about the fact that Deku wasn't playing and it was Izuku Midoriya who was, and then he thought about the fact that one of his goals was to show everyone that he wasn't to be viewed as weak, that he was to be seen as what he was. Then the answer came easier. Myself and everybody else. Hitoshi didn't balk at the answer or become accusatory. His eyes didn't even change from their tired, amused look, as long as we're on the same page. And then he was smiled at and an arm was slugged around his shoulder as they entered the school building. Come in, come in. How are the 2 of you today? Nizu led them into his office, still in the same suit as ever, and motioned them over to his desk where Hitoshi slid his phone out and placed it in his lap. Seeing Nizu focus on the attempt at secrecy, Izuku activated his own phone recording in his pocket. There wasn't even a twitch to show that Nizu noticed the sudden increase in frequency, courtesy to Hitoshi pretending to turn the volume up. We're good, Principal Nizu. Though, The boss here has a few things to ask you. The motions are too stiff, the tone too formal. Perfect. High Specs gave Nizu one of the highest intelligences in the world to date. That meant he would pick up on the subtle cues of someone lying to him. However, not long after the stain incident, the principal had asked him to come talk, and they'd gotten onto the conversational topic of quirks and analysis. Through that, Izuku had learnt that despite abundant intelligence, Nizu found it difficult to pick apart and understand the complexity of human emotions. He wouldn't be able to tell the difference between Hitoshi playing up these cues and actually exhibiting them. He can tell his plan is working as planned from the way that even as Nizu's attention turns to him, Izuku can see his ears keep twitching in Hitoshi's direction. He had known from the second he let Nizu know he was bringing Hitoshi that the rat would figure out he would be using Hitoshi as a buffer. However, with the fact that Hitoshi had hidden the recording device, it made it look like Izuku was distracting Nizu from Hitoshi. It was a good way to counteract High Specs. Let him work it all out and then do what he expected but not. Oh. Yeah, I was wondering if you could tell us the announcement possibilities we'll hear throughout the exercise. An interesting request. He could see High Specs twirling to life behind Nizu's eyes. He loved seeing people who believed wholeheartedly that they had the upper hand become pawns. But not one that I can find any issue in fulfilling. He hid his own grin as a sadistic glint entered the rat's eyes. May I ask though, Midoriya, why are you having your second record me? So that we can run through a drill and how to avoid hearing certain possibilities and reacting to others. I was hoping to play them when my team broke one of the rules during practice. Interesting. As I said, I don't see any reason why I can't help you. But next time just ask to record me. Of course, sir. He faked a look of annoyance at Hitoshi, who faked a wince and awkward shrugging of shoulders. Sure, it was redundant at first glance to pretend that the other was recording, however on a less superficial level it was exactly what they needed. If Nizu thought he could figure them out, it allowed more wriggle room. Now, for the most common statement you could hear, Midoriya Izuku of the villain team has been captured. Of course, we would address you as any titles we have heard you be referred to as, if requested. Thank you. For someone on the opposite team it would be the same, except it would refer to them as follows. Midoriya Izuku of the hero team has been captured. That was intense. I could practically feel the mental battle going on in there. Shinso let out a sigh as they exited the office and began to walk down the corridor when a familiar voice was heard down the corridor. Todoroki, are you sure Midoriya really is in the school building? Yes. I had Koji's birds follow him. I'm convinced there's something off about Midoriya being on the villain team. Smiling at Hitoshi, the boy only sighed fondly, and they began to get ready. Izuku leant against the wall with his arms crossed, and Hitoshi stood across from him, boxing him in. They began to argue at a level that you would only hear once you came to this part of the corridor. I told you, I'm not going to request to change. He forced his voice to crack when he heard Ida's and Todoroki's footsteps grow closer. Why the hell not? Clearly you only joined the villain's side out of pity. He could see them in the corner of his eye and unfolded his arms and got in Hitoshi's face. It wasn't out of pity. What? Don't tell me you have a crush on Yaoyorozu? Despite the fact he'd planned this out with Hitoshi last night, the question was still so sudden and out there that his red face was genuine. You do. I do not. Besides, what would that have to do with changing teams? It means you don't have a reason to be on the villain team. He saw the smirk Hitoshi sent him. And he got ready for the finale, seeing his friends stalled in the corridor just watching them argue. I'm not going to go to Nizu and request to change teams because you're jealous. I'm not jealous. I just want you to realize you need to stop letting people walk all over you. I'm not. Just go away and leave me alone. Midoriya? He'd practiced the deer in the headlights look years ago till even his mother had begun to believe the look, and he took liberties with that when he swung around, pushing lightly against Hitoshi, though because the other acted like it was a violent push, and came face to face with Todoroki and Ida. The peppermint-colored teen was staring with no emotion as usual, though his voice had sounded quite confused when he'd said his name. He'd been told by Koji that Todoroki had requested a tail on him, and so they created an act that would allow for him and Hitoshi to be around each other during school hours more and get them off any lingering scent that he could be the leader. After all, the leader wouldn't be arguing with his boyfriend about changing teams. Todoroki, Ida, what are you doing here? He felt himself blush when Hitoshi pulled him into the taller's side. They'd left the confrontation stage to improv, and it was clearly the right choice because whatever Hitoshi did would get actual reactions from him. We came to talk to Nizu, but what are you doing here? So despite being a council system, Todoroki still has a second that's interesting. I can see why he wouldn't want Bakugo but Uraraka? She isn't as stiff about rules as Ida, so she'd be the one I'd go for. But two legacies together does make an appealing powerhouse unit. Come on Izuku, let's go. Nodding, he allowed Hitoshi to gently push him past his friends by the arm around his shoulder, but they both stopped when Todoroki called out. I'm having a conversation with Midoriya. It's rude to walk off mid-conversation. And it's rude to listen into a private conversation, but that didn't stop you two voyeuristic BSRs, did it? An eyebrow was arched and the two Hero Corps students spluttered and tried to come up with excuses. We're going, enjoy your talk with Nizu. They passed with no incident after that, and Izuku felt himself genuinely leaning into Hitoshi the further away they went from Todoroki and Ida as he slowly started to lose the ability to not burst out laughing. When they made it to the front door, he finally lost it, and the arm around him was the only thing keeping him up as he erupted into full-blown laughter. That's not fair. I want to fake date Izuku. Toshi, break up with him so I can have him. We'll be the ultimate power couple. With my inventions and your cunning will be unstoppable. Mei pumped a fist into the air and Izuku felt his smile grow when his present teammates started laughing. Yosetsu looked up from his welding and over to him. Was it really necessary to pretend to be dating him? Couldn't you just do it as the friends you are? He shrugged from where he was sat upside down on the couch. I mean, yeah. But then you would have questions as to why Hitoshi knew about me being on the villain team. However, if he was my boyfriend, it would make sense that I'd tell him. Sen lolled right side up on the couch next to him, a DS in hand as he waited for the next time Mei needed him for her homemade tank. It makes sense, I guess, but why Hitoshi? I mean, no offense, dude. The boy in mention waved a dismissive hand over his shoulder from where he was practically leaning in the engine. But wouldn't someone as gorgeous as myself have been a better fit? The snort that rose from both boys was friendly and wasn't at all condescending, which was a plus because it meant that this was allowing Hitoshi to make friends. You're not his type, man. Was called out of the engine. What, and Mei and Hitoshi are? Reiko, who was sitting next to Denki as the two of them tried to get the new support equipment on the blonde, added, you can't forget Nito either. Oh, heaven forbid. He let out a snort. Dude, your type is just socially inept and touch-starved strays. Denki called out before letting out a yeah as the equipment stayed on. You calling me a beach sparky? Mei appeared out from under the tank in record time and had a wrench pointed endearingly at the blonde. No ma'am. That's what I'm calling Nito. For that he received a pat on the head. As you were. And with that the pink-haired girl was bounding over to him. Look, Izuku, I have to level with you. After saying that, she crouched down and he let out a laugh and was rewarded with her signature scheming smile. I love you, really, really do. However, I'm gonna go crazy if I keep having people come and go from my lab all day every day. It's only 10 am on the third day. He knew this problem would arise sooner or later. Your lab has garage doors, yeah? And UA has a track, doesn't it? She nodded. Well, we could borrow one of the garages and have that be the base of operations for equipment production. Her smile grew at that. And then you could keep your lab as your tinkering room. Perfect. Bouncing up from her crouch, Mei clapped her hands. All right. Everybody up, we're moving out now. I'll go get Momo and Blondie and move them out. She seemed to get a thought suddenly as her eyes turned mad. I can test out my new baby while we're there. The 9 of them, plus the tank, made it to U.A's practice track without much incident. The fact that Aizawa stared him in the eye as he and Mei pushed its inoperable husk past him to the track just made him even more convinced that Nizu had issued orders to let them do as they wish. The rat was more interested in seeing his moves than he was in playing Izuku himself, however that was an advantage. When the game truly started, Nizu would hopefully be stumped for a few seconds. Izuku had lived his life exploiting precious few seconds of confusion. The track itself was a sight to behold. A simple ring circuit was flanked on both sides by garages, with doors on both sides for easy chemical access. The buildings looked to be 2 floors tall, but knowing the school, a basement wasn't off the cards. As they got closer to the track, the last stretch being just him, as May had gotten struck by inspiration for improvements and was writing them on a pad, he noticed that the simple track was anything but. There were interlocking teeth groves in the floor, which May explained opened up and allowed for fake buildings to come up and create a cityscape on the track. He'd glanced at May's gleeful features when she explained that she loved that feature the most, as she got to test her babies in a collateral environment. Evangelion was definitely the right codename. Next she'll start wanting to make angels. Alright, my worker drones, here we are, Hatsum Forge 2.0. As the garage door opened and he began pushing the tank into its new home, he heard a few laughs and comments about being referred to as robots. Finally getting the vehicle, the first of many apparently, into place, he was relieved to see the building was only 2 floors. Alright everyone, attention snapping to him, and he stretched his stiff arms above his head. Momo, Nito, could you please continue weapon production? At their nods he continued, I'll have Kyoka, Rikido, Yuga and Fumiko come pick some of them up. Snipe Sensei has agreed to start training us in small doses. Hitoshi, are you still up for helping May, or do you need a break? I'm good, boss. The boy rolled his shoulders, and his smirk was enhanced by the oil smears on his face. Izuku resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He was just happy Hitoshi was becoming more comfortable around people outside of their small group of friends. A ways? Sen? Are you guys still good? The duo gave him matching grins and thumbs up. The two were too preoccupied by whatever game Sen was playing, so he took that as his answer. Turning to Denki and Reiko, he took note of how the blonde looked uncomfortable in his new support gear. Denki, the boy looked up shocked almost that he was being addressed. I'm meeting with Mona after this, want to come with? Sure, dude. He didn't like how surprised and unsure the blonde seemed about the invitation. That was something he'd need to change. The idea that somebody who portrayed such over-the-top confidence and swagger was so easily thrown off by such a simple comment rubbed him the wrong way. And me? Looking to Reiko, he set another personal mission to help lessen the sad look in her eyes. I've got a really important job for you, Reiko. Your quirk enables telekinesis, right? When she responded with a small yes, he continued, Shoji, Kendo and Juzo are transporting some materials to May's workshop. It's pretty delicate but heavy stuff. Think you could give them a hand? Heavy but delicate. And you are entrusting that responsibility to me? Only if you're up for it. I'm sure they can handle it, but I had to pull a few favors to get my hands on the stuff. He shrugged, not noticing the intrigued looks he was being sent. Ooh, what have you got me now, dear Kumichu? May had pounced on him in seconds. An arm was thrown around his neck from behind as she leant her head over his shoulder. From that position looking down, he could see in full form the excited smirk on her face. You'll have to wait and see, won't you? All I'll say is that the management course are gods and goddesses. The management course? Nito perked up from where he'd slumped into an office's chair. You're really embracing the whole year-side aspect of the exercise. Patting the arm slung around his neck, May released him. We get scored on realism as well as on our overall approach. He waved his hand nonchalantly. Because of that, if we were to have sponsors or faux businesses to our group's name, it wouldn't be too different than real villain income fronts. There was a silence where he realized that, again, too much had been said. Dude, that is cool. You've really thought of everything, huh? He felt a blush crawl up his skin. I wouldn't go that far. So, why are we meeting Mina? Glancing at Denki from the corner of his eye, he went back to surveying the area, still cautious after the events earlier in the morning. It's about costumes. Besides equipment material, I struck a deal for costume material. Mina begged for artistic input on our costumes. Kurwaro also has some of the more popular designs from the ones I sent around, so he'll be there as well. And I'm here because? He let out an amused huff. You're not exactly the extrovert you portray yourself as, are you? He can see the raising of an eyebrow in his peripheral. Oh, you can handle social interaction and people like Bakugu, no sweat, but the minute you're in an environment you don't know how to handle, you turn into an introvert. A laugh came from Denki and he cringed at how fake it sounded. Was that how he used to sound in the beginning? He'd never truly appreciated how blind and deaf people became as soon as the word quirkless was stamped on your forehead. You've got an interesting sense of humor there, dude. There's no use lying to me. He turned to look at the blonde. I've spent years reading people. You guys are practically open books to me. It's not something to be ashamed of. They continued walking, a quiet settling over them that wasn't awkward per se, but instead heavy with the feeling of pulling at an open wound. Am I that obvious? The voice is incredibly small. Not particularly. Like I said, you guys are practically open books to me. If it helps, Bakugu used to have claustrophobia when we were kids. He used to play it off that he didn't like it because he couldn't use his explosions, but I could always see the fear in his eyes. Should you really be telling me this? Should you really be on the villain team, Denki? Stopped and didn't remove his eyes from the Bond's back. The other boy was frozen in front of him and didn't turn around to face him. You're not registered on either team, so I have to wonder, what are you doing exactly? I'm not sure. Shaking his head, he shoved his hands in his pockets, glad that the way from the track to the meeting place was pretty secluded. What do you want to do, Denki? At the tenderness that entered the air, he added, no one's asked you that before, have they? No. Everyone wants me to be this amazing hero. But I've never understood how to get control of my quirk, and then Todoroki came out as the hero leader and I thought, here's my chance to make everyone happy. Denki turned to him, and then Kyoka said she was thinking of joining the villain team, and the thought that it was the first time I could do something for myself came to mind. But then just seeing how happy and genuine about this everyone is. The blonde laughed. I couldn't just sign up when I was just here for selfish reasons. He didn't do it normally, but he walked up to the blonde, who watched him like a hawk, and cuffed him atop of the head. Idiot. The Bond's jaw dropped, as if that has ever stopped anyone from doing anything. If it's selfish, everyone gets to be selfish. Sometimes we're all human. At the end of the day, quirks don't change that. He began walking again. Let's hurry up or the two drama queens will have our heads. And I'm not talking about the management department. Behind him, Denki laughed. Just like that? Not gonna demand I go sign up for the villain team. Despite the questioning, Denki sped up to keep pace. I'm not going to force you to do anything. This is a team, not a military unit. Your standing beside me is enough to answer enough. I'll sign up after this meeting. He felt a grin slide onto his face. Good man. Punctuality is a virtue, boss. He grinned at Mina and Kurwaro, noting that management hadn't turned up yet, as the management will tell you it's fashionably late. As he settled into a chair in one of the management course's office meeting rooms, the door behind him opened and a horde of management course kids poured in, an evil gleam in their eyes. His three teammates settled into seats next to him, and he made sure his posture was as good as it could be as the head of the fabric company settled into the seat across the table from him. Mr. Midoriya, I hope we didn't keep you waiting long. The other kids either settled merchandise on the table or set up charts on stands. He smiled a Midoriya Izuku smile. No bother, as I was explaining to my compatriots, it's called being fashionably late. A gleeful grin was his response, along with a half-wistful, very true. I see you have the merchandise I asked for. Yes, only the best for our most loyal customers. The fact he was possibly the first and only customer went unsaid. And you intend to uphold your end of the bargain? The loud, confident tone dropped into a worried quibble. Pulling his phone out, he showed the first draft designs for advertisements he'd made shortly after waking up. They were quick, scruffy, but they showed that he was serious about the deal. I uphold all my promises. Are you sure you're okay with us using your company's name during the exercise, though? I'm not sure how to credit you all, he motioned to the entire collection of students, without ruining the surprise. If I can just suggest something for a moment, why not allow us to say that we have gotten a sponsorship from the hero course? The credit is given and the teachers don't know what you intend to do. A tall girl from the corner of the room spoke up. Despite her impressive height, she was relatively normal looking. Izuka had a feeling she slipped under the radar quite well. He immediately pinged her on his own personal radar. Someone like that was someone to keep an eye on. That sounds like a brilliant deal, miss. He turned back to the boss. What do you say? A matching crooked grin to the one on his face appeared. I think we have a deal, Midoriya. Oh, sorry. The boss rephrased. I think we have a deal, Kumicho. It's been a pleasure doing business with you. May we interest you in listening to our full presentation? Unfortunately, he pulled himself out of his chair and along with Mina and Kurwaro collected the materials. I'm not able to. However, my rep for this Kaminari Denki is free and I'm sure I would be more than happy to. He ignored the pleading look as Denki crumbled under the full force of over 10 management course students giving him pleading eyes. We'll be off then. As they left the room, door closing behind them, Kurwaro leant closer. Don't you think that was a bit mean? See it as punishment. Even if he did nothing wrong, we can't have him thinking pulling our chain is all right. Mina laughed. That sounds so wrong. He found himself snickering. I booked a support room, so we can work on the outfits and other skills together. Other skills? Some of us are going to need to learn the basics of plumbing for one of my plans. I'm learning it along with Toru and Mashiaro. I may ask, boss, how do you plan on doing that? He smiled at Kurwaro. My mother is good friends with a plumber and told him I was interested, so he's agreed to give me a crash course of the basics over video chat. Huh. The 1B student hummed before facing forward and Izuku did the same when the boy continued. Hey Izuku, who's that? He was surprised to see his mother had arrived early and was happily chatting with Mashiaro and Toru. Oh, Izuku. She looked up and spotted him and he felt his grin widen. Sorry for turning up early, dear. Nizu phoned and said you'd asked if I could come earlier. Careful, Nizu, people are going to start thinking you have favorites. Brushing the thought away, he simply continued to smile. It's fine, Mama. These are my friends Mina and Koro. They're really creative. And agreed to help with the costumes. His mother's smile widened and her eyes softened as she inspected the two teens next to him. The two tensed up as if afraid that they wouldn't meet her expectations. Ah, you're the girl with the acid quirk, aren't you? You were very impressive in your one-on-ones. A glance to the left after a snort from Toru and a sly grin from Mashiaro led to him seeing Mina going a beetroot pink. And Kurwaro, was it? The way you used your quirk in the obstacle course was amazing. It really caught my eye. It's a shame you didn't get through to the one-on-ones. Looking to the right, he couldn't see any color change due to the boy's complexion, but the bashful nature of his expression said enough. All right, Mama, you're gonna make them pass out if you're not careful. The inside of the spare support room felt strangely clinical without the hum of electric machinery and the permeating smell of oil and solder that was a given in May's workshop. Thankfully, there was more than enough bench space and the sewing machines he had gotten permission to borrow were already set up. Did you get the pictures I asked for, Toru? Placing the box of material on the desks with the machines, his mother smiling brightly with an evil look in her eyes as she took it and turned to her poor unsuspecting apprentices, he turned to his own would-be apprentices. The invisible girl placed the pictures with a cheerful chirp of yes, and he and Mashiaro crowded around the pictures of the pipe system beneath the hero base. It was surprisingly easy. "Shut up, boss, there are cameras there." They were disengaged, but they were all over. Well, that was an interesting development. Not an entirely unaccounted for one, but he'd have to adjust the plan for now. How new did they look? He couldn't see her expression, but he guessed it was pensive and he slid the images over to Mashiaro. Not too old, the plaster hiding the wires still looked wet, but that could have been the damp. He nodded at her and stepped back to allow her to slide next to the blonde boy. Nuzi must have figured he'd do something like this from the beginning. With how Adam and Aizawa seemed on them being given a certain advantage, there was a snowflake in hell chance of him spilling. He wouldn't put it past the rat to have the feed go straight to the hero's main surveillance room. Being slightly behind schedule was proving to be a blessing. They wouldn't have known about the cameras until it was too late if they'd have acted any earlier. Hey! A nudge to his arm had him looking over to his companions. Look here. I don't know much about plumbing, but I do know what this is. A finger was stabbed onto the picture pointing at a small, insignificant-looking valve that will shut off all the water. It acts like a kill switch. When our pipes burst the other week my mother had me turn ours. That might just work. You said the cameras were everywhere? He looked in the general direction of Toru hoping he was looking her in the eye. Yeah. On the pipes, the way in and everywhere down the tunnel to this valve. There was a wrinkle in the paper next to the valve indicating the girl had pointed. Crossing his arms he paced. What's the layout of the tunnel like? There's only one way in and out from the sewers, but I noticed a doorway at the end of the tunnel, probably connects the basement to the sewers. Other than that, the tunnel itself can't be more than 11 meters long and is divided into 2 narrow walkways by the sewage. He was developing a mental image of the area. The entrance to the tunnel, is it a corner or an intersection? 6-way intersection. He could hear the cunning in Turu's voice as she seemed to catch on. I just barely made it in and out without becoming lost because you had that amazing map. If they tried to chase us down the sewers, they'd be lost. We have a lot to learn, but this will be crucial for a major debilitating strike against the heroes. Are you sure you want to do this? It will probably be boring as hell. We're sure. I just want to know what the hell your plan for the pipes are. He tapped his nose. When Nito and Momo finish up, I'll let everyone know. Until then, it's radio silence. DMN. How do you have the measurements for our entire group? It's kind of creepy. Looking up from his piece of pipe that he'd been studying, he looked over to Mina. You know UA has public records of all its students on the internet for easy accessibility for pros looking for interns. You don't need any kind of special thing to access them. They're just on the internet for any creepy stalker to see? Yep. He clicked his tongue in annoyance as his scrap refused to cooperate. Shiketsu does it as well. We're sister schools, so we're constantly competing. I do have to wonder about the legality of that though. You are all minors after all. He could hear the worry in his mother's voice, but brushed it off. As long as UA churns out good heroes, the government continues to turn a blind eye. At the silence that settled, a regular occurrence as of late, he looked around. What? That sounds like you know something we don't. Part of the reason these pipes are so important is because of something UA is allowed to keep on school grounds because the government don't care. He couldn't quite keep the contempt out of his voice. He was within every right to use the drag, but he hated that it was so readily available. Sheet. I need to talk to Recovery Girl. Dropping his pipe and wrench to the table, he grabbed his jacket from the back of his seat and threw goodbyes over his shoulder, not bothering to see the curious looks sent his way. You want to know the recipe for my gummies? As I'm sure you're aware, Recovery Girl, the first-year exam is the lockdown scenario. He resisted the urge to shuffle his feet. I've done my research, and despite already preparing for lack of food, I haven't found any other way to help keep my team rejuvenated. The old lady hummed. I can see why you would come to that conclusion. Would it not be easier to just request pre-made gummies though, dear? He made sure to keep eye contact, not wanting to come off as suspicious. That'd be depleting you then. Besides, if we had access to a readily available source, we run the risk of addiction. He'd thought this through. The rejuvenating gummy bears would act as a stimulant, something to chew on when they felt themselves nodding off when they needed to be awake. Plus, in a pinch, the medicine could help speed up the healing process of the body, so if somebody became injured, it would help. Another reason he wanted the recipe was because he wanted to allow everyone to showcase their talents during this, and he knew for a fact Rikido was still self-conscious about his baking and sweet-making abilities. Sound reasoning. I swear, Midoriya, you become less like that man-child every day. Although, she looked up at him with a skeptical look, I do worry that you're going to have Toshi in here with a heart attack after this. Laughing and rubbing the back of his neck, he realized some of his plans, scratch that a good 99% of them, would probably cause cardiac arrest for his poor mentor. I can't make promises. So, could I please have the recipe? Of course. She lifted herself from her chair and went over to her impossibly tall filing cabinet. I've had the recipe worked out since I was in first year here, you know. She sounded wistful, and he kept close interested in the memories possibly about to be shared. The first version was like overdosing on caffeine. You couldn't take any other form of drag for a good 10 hours after, and you would be a shaking wreck because of it. The new one's been modified since, obviously. He noticed she pulled out 2 sheets of paper, one crumpled, worn and disciplined with age, the other simply wrinkling at the edges where hands found familiar grip. Turning, Recovery Girl handed them both over. She had a knowing look in her eyes as the handoff happened. "I know you're using the nausea knockout drag," she shook her head, "so I can only assume you have no inhibitions about the exercise." Looking down at the older sheet, it had been the paper on top. He paused, noticing the tiny, almost faded scribble in the bottom corner, and he felt his mouth twitch. The older version will be good in case someone is captured. The opposition won't be able to drag them, so they'll be set if they break out. Bowing, he carefully cradled the sheets to his chest. "I'll bring them back as soon as we have our own copies." She waved her hand nonchalantly with a knowing smile. "Keep the new version for yourself, though I would like my first pass back." "Of course." "Thank you, Recovery Girl. Have a nice day." "You as well, Midoriya." Walking out the nurse's office, he took one last glance at the scribble in the bottom corner, feeling his smile widen. Should make the hero team. Unable to use their quirk properly, villain team should practice under influence. Ask principal for permission. Chio. Making it back to the dorms, he hid the papers in his jacket pocket as he entered the building, checking the wall clock as he removed his shoes to see it was 5 at night. They might still be with Snipe-sensei. I don't want to risk pushing the papers under the door though. His thoughts were disrupted by the signature sound of explosions and Bakugu's fist hitting the wall inches from his nose. "Deku. Kaken." He turned to look at the blonde, not even having to fake the fear in his eyes. He'd forgotten he was keeping up his front in front of the rest of their dorm mates. What if Bakugu had seen the papers? How are you today?" Red eyes narrowed, seemingly contemplating his next few words, which was unusual. "Why the hell was your mother here not 10 minutes ago asking for you, looking scared shitless for you?" "Oh, thank Cammy." His mother was an amazing actress, and he hadn't been sure what time he'd be back, so he'd left it to his mother to start this next plan. "Did you see which way she went?" "I should go find her dash." "Answer the question, Deku." If there was one thing he could count on nowadays with Bakugu, it was the fact that all the Bakugus loved and cared for his mother. It had simply been a matter of making sure the blonde had seen his mother. The stuttering was faked, of course, but it must have been convincing because Bakugu's posturing relented slightly. "I had a fight with my boyfriend and I was really upset, so I called her." He wished he could have had a camera at the way red eyes widened at him, so shamelessly saying the word boyfriend. "I was me, you know. So I got really teary and said I was gonna take a walk, and I guess she came to check up on me. I just checked my phone and I had a few missed calls. She does worry too much sometimes." It was muttered so that no one else was supposed to hear it, but Izuka did, and he internally sighed. Trusted on his luck that his childhood bully ex-friend cared for his mother but hated his guts. "I'll go look for her, okay?" "I am." "Kaken, can you move please?" "Whatever, shitty Deku. Don't make her heavy worry. She already has to put up with you, don't make her stress more." "Of course." With that he turned around and slid his shoes back on exiting the dorm. His mother's appearance served two purposes. If he was in the dorms, it would allow for him to know the current production of costumes were done, and two, if like now he wasn't, it allowed for the same thing but also let him help spread the seed of him having a partner. That way it wouldn't be questioned or scrutinized too heavily when he and Hitoshi were around the place. He'd just have to give the papers to Rikido tonight and have the next round of third group get basic gun training so that the boy could start on that instead of missing any form of training. Speaking of, he'd received a confirmation of approval. Email meaning he could start applying for the explosives handling courses. "Hey everyone, mama." Sitting in the UA canteen was the entire villain team, including Koji, and his mother. He was happy to see everyone tucking into dinner. In suit bags lay what he presumed were the first round of costumes. There was almost enough for the entire group, so the three had worked. Walking down the 2 rows of tables, he greeted everyone individually. The gun squad looked pleased, as did the production squad. Everyone looked happy with their work, and he felt happy himself. The only one who looked remarkably put out was Denki. "I take it the presentation was as boring as I expected?" The blonde have him a sour glare. "If I didn't know you were so strong and our leader, I would seriously be thinking of attacking you right now." The amount of flow charts their teammates looked over, flow charts that I had to look at was ridiculous. "Poor baby." Mina pulled the boy to her, resting her chin on his head as the boy spouted, "I'm sorry I didn't try and talk him out of it, it was just too funny." "You knew?" "Boss." Turning around he saw Mezu sat, all 6 arms relaxed and practically limp. "The gear you had us move. You sure we're allowed it on school grounds?" "I got the confirmation of approval email not long before it got here, don't worry." "I take it May was excited?" The silver-haired boy chuckled. "You could say that." Wouldn't stop hugging Hitoshi in excitement until he brainwashed her. "Sounds like May. Speaking of, she did remember it was dinner and then training, right?" At his query his lieutenant looked around, eyebrows furrowing. She was here a minute ago." "Under the table." Looking across to Juzo, the teen pointed a finger to underneath the table. "She just kind of slithered under there." Crouching he pulled the tablecloth up to see under, greeting himself with the sight of May sat crossed-legged on the floor messing with exploding putty and a cartoon-looking thing. He felt himself shaking his head. Of course, May wouldn't just bring any contraption to mess with, she'd bring the FING makeshift explosions. "Hey!" She looked up, smiling and waving, just barely missing hitting Mez's leg. "How are you doing?" "Good. You?" "Fantastic, carry on." Dropping the tablecloth he stood back up, face palming. "Boss? She could drop a diamond bomb at any second, what the hell am I doing with my life?" With that he walked off to slump next to his mother, half aware of the squawking and, "Oich my god why did you bring the explosives in here?" going on behind him. After dinner had been eaten and everyone safely assured that May wasn't in fact planning on blowing them all sky high, training began. Koji's birds were stationed outside the gym on all sides to ensure that no heroes spied on them, and May had control of the cameras on a loop from the previous night's feed so even the school wouldn't know what they were doing. It was supposed to be a surprise. After all in their P uniforms, he looked out at his team, taking down a mental register of who was from where. Class 1A's portion of the team consisted of Rikido, Koji, Fumikage, or Fumiko as he'd taken to calling the bird-headed boy, Toru, Mashiaro, Momo, Kyoka, Yuga, Mina, Denki, and Mezu. There was definitely a couple of wild cards in that mix, Koji, Mina, and Denki being the biggest ones. They weren't wild cards because their actions were unpredictable, more that they would be the ones to most throw off the hero team, especially Koji with his sweet nature. Class 1B took up less of the team. Nito, Juzo, Sen, Setsuna, Yosetsu, Reiko, Kendo. The class rep hadn't been fully comfortable with being called by her first name, and Kurwaro. Again, the boy wasn't fully comfortable with his first name being used but seemed to be coming around to the idea. Again, there were a few wild cards, mainly Kendo and Nito. Kendo, being class rep, was probably expected to go the hero side without so much as a second thought. Nito's less than stellar personality with the majority of 1A would put him in the gray area for most. As long as the 1B kids didn't blab, 1A would hopefully remain blissfully ignorant and think he was having a hissy fit and holding out on choosing the hero team for as long as possible. It was an interesting mix, and something he found quite interesting was that a large majority of 1A felt more inclined to the villain side of the exercise than the hero side, whereas the opposite was true for 1B. That would be an informing experience to look into. But then you also had Hitoshi repping 1C and May repping all the support course classes, along with his co-conspirators in the management course. It truly was a school-wide experience. All right, his friends turned to him and he held his ground. He hadn't realized until that moment, but he was responsible for the training, safety, and actions of 21 people. Those who don't have as much skill in quirkless fights to the left side of the gym, mutant quirks included in that stay where you are. He knew that was mainly Mashiaro, but Fumiko also stayed where he was. Sadly, a large majority of his group went to the left of the gym. I'm guessing that means everyone else is capable of quirkless fighting to a degree? At the nods he sighed internally. This was going to a draining next 4 days. Alright, Nito, pick a quirk. Everyone, you're going to take turns fighting Nito while he uses your quirk. This will allow you to learn your limits, and allow Nito to learn control over your quirk, which will help in team-up situations. Everyone nodded and he realized they were waiting for him to continue. I'll be helping with the quirkless combat. Everyone get out sparring mats. Each match should last no longer than 5 minutes. Holy Shitazuku, what do you eat? Too tired to even bother arguing, he grumbled and pushed his head back down into Hitoshi's shoulder. The purple-haired boy had thankfully agreed to let Izuku get a piggyback ride back to the dorms. Boss doesn't look that heavy. Toru piped up somewhere to his left and he summoned enough energy to thank her. 3 consecutive days of minimal sleep, adding up to 10 hours over the entire 3 days, and constant strenuous mental and physical activity had wiped him out, leading to him barely staying upright after training had ended. Trust me, he's heavy. I'm just glad this idiot had me on weights training since I started helping with Mei in the lab. Izuku told you to go on weights training? He had his eyes closed, so he didn't know how many of his dorm mates were in this particular clump of students, but he knew that at least Toru and Mina were, as the other girl's voice sounded from his right. Toshi nearly dropped a box of gears on his foot, so I told him he needed to get some muscle. He cracked his eyes open at the that followed. Mina and he presumed from the shifting of selves, Toru were walking backwards in front of him and hit so high. You're such a caring person, Izuku. And look, he's blushing. Peering around at his best friend's face, he saw the boy was in fact blushing. I just didn't want Mei skinning me, it wasn't that kind. He was shifted higher on Hitoshi's back, causing him to almost fall off. Hey, I'll drop you next time. And here I was thinking you actually cared about me. From his higher-up position, he stiffly punched Hitoshi's shoulder, grumbling all the while. You know I care, you but. Spotting watching eyes from the doorway, he huffed before adding, I wouldn't go out with you if I didn't. It took a few seconds for Mina and Toru to catch on, but when they turned and saw the hero team's war council standing in the dorm's doorway, they simply smiled back at him and Hitoshi. Keeping up the act, Hitoshi lowered him to his feet and the 2 girls were quick to his side as his sluggish body swayed. He nearly jumped out of his skin when Hitoshi's voice practically boomed to reach the fore. Well, looks like XHBeansome is a common occurrence in 1A. At the timed complaints of the 2 girls, Hitoshi gave them a tired raised brow. You 2 have been stalking Izuku and I for the better part of the evening. Well yeah, but when Momo told us you were going on a date, we had to make sure our precious Midoriya had a worthy boyfriend. He had left it up to chance what kind of excuse they'd come up with, and this one was slightly problematic, but he could handle it. Yawning, he leaned slightly more on Mina. Yeah well, Mama already decided that Toshi was worthy when she spoke with us before we left. A visible shiver ran up Hitoshi's spine. Your mother is actually terrifying. I thought for sure she was going to kill me. He smiled at the response, privately knowing that she probably could kill and get away with it. He had to learn his skills from somewhere, didn't he? Come on, lover boy, you're clearly exhausted, let's get you to bed. Mina linked arms with him and Toru did the same. If we didn't know any better, we'd say you did more than go out for food. Did you do something while we weren't looking? The teasing hadn't been something he'd planned on, and his face went bright red despite how tired he was, and he put his hands on his face as well as he could with both arms linked. The 2 girls laughed their heads off at him, and Hitoshi removed one of his hands and then pretended to kiss his cheek before whispering in his ear, I was joking about the XHBeansome thing, but they're still watching. Night, Toshi. Playing it off as nothing more than a departing gesture, he allowed himself to be dragged away and towards the dorms, the 2 girls giggling all the while. When they got to the entrance, and sure enough the 4 teens were dividing their attention between himself and Hitoshi, he was greeted with the War Council's expectant looks. Ashido Hagakure. Could you give us a minute with Midoriya? Todoroki may have been the leader, but it seemed his earlier suspicion that Ida was his second was confirmed as the blue-haired boy stepped in their way, blocking them. Look, he doesn't need his friends ganging up on him again. Mina's voice was filled with an anger he hadn't heard before, and he turned to look at the girl, shocked. The way you acted when you cornered him the other day isn't how friends act. Blondie, and she gestured to Bakugo, and Izuku saw the lights of heaven when the blonde simply gave a gruff huff. And Siro didn't give a sheet when me and Denki joined the villain team. So why do you get to act all high and mighty? His friend's face pulled a blank, and he could almost hear the error 404 noise their brains must have been making as they took in the words. Midoriya has just had a nice date after making up with his boyfriend, so why don't you leave him alone and come back when you're not all going to jump down his throat? Oh wow, even Toru sounded sad. He'd asked these 2 to come along because he knew they were good at talking on the fly, but he hadn't expected that they'd become genuinely angry for him. That was something new he hadn't experienced for. Sure, with his friends they'd all been angry at the same thing before, but nobody had ever been angry for him. Guys, it's fine, he smiled, unsure. I'm sure they just want to talk. Nope. Not happening, Midoriya. You're going off to bed and these guys are going to evaluate if what they were going to say was something a friend would say. With that, he was pushed towards the elevator by his two teammates and forced into the metal box with Mina pressing the button for his floor before he could even react. On the way up his phone rang, and pulling it out he answered without looking at the ID. He regretted that when all he heard from the other line was laughing. Finally the wheezing calmed down and Nito's voice called out, "May has the security feed from outside your dorms, you should see them. They're just standing there." May's voice was also heard, making him think that perhaps he was on speaker. "Izu, glasses looks like a fish. Ha. And in the girl her face is, I can't breath, her face is bright red." He didn't know if May had access to the camera he knew was hidden in the elevator and so kept his features schooled as his two gremlin friends gave him a laughter-filled running commentary of what the War Council was up to. "You're recording the audio for them, aren't you?" May's laughter died down though Nito's was still full force. And was that a thump? Did he fall to the ground? "Yeah, if they talk about plans or talk smack we'll know about it." "Great." The elevator pinged and he stepped out onto his floor, walking straight to his room. "Don't have too much fun, you two." The bang from before happened again and he heard Neuro start cackling about how May had gone bright red and hit the floor. The two began to argue with him and each other while he entered his room, a bright smile on his face. Day 4, day 3 of prep, began with 3 emails and about 20 unread messages on the group chat. After sifting through all that and realizing that it was mostly useless stuff that didn't matter, the emails were just confirmations and the messages a meme war of all things, he'd checked the time to realize he'd gotten up at 4 am. Deciding to use the fact his teammates thought it was appropriate to spam memes at 4 in the morning, he started issuing orders for the free time during the day and setting up regimes for after-school training. He didn't feel remorseful in the slightest. He decided the best course of action then would be to get ready for school and finish any homework, as he had a suspicion that they were going to be expected to have completed things early so they could cancel hero lessons. Aizawa had mentioned that that was standard protocol after all. He could only hope that it was true. Otherwise he was going to be working on a tighter schedule than B was already planning for. On the bright side though, with Nizu's interest he could probably get permission for it. Hopefully. There was no point worrying about that though, he had to push past it and deal. "Alright, listen up." He kept his eyes firmly on Aizawa as the man stood at the front of the room. While their teacher could be tired and sluggish, he'd never been late for homeroom, and right now they were getting increasingly closer to encroaching on first PRD. "Classes are cancelled for the rest of this week." There were a few cheers from around the room, and he was amused when he heard no villains join in the celebration. They knew that more free time meant he'd be pushing them to their limits and beyond. Plus Ultra and all that other crap, he described it as. "Thursday is your last day of prep and on Friday you're being shipped off, so there's no point in having conventional classes." The cheers stopped then, as people finally came to grips with the fact that this was really happening. The exercise was real. And then, as soon as Aizawa explained that when first PRD started they'd be off to their designated areas, bragging started. Well, bragging wasn't perhaps the right word. But as soon as the all-clear was silently sounded, the hero team seemed to relax. From a quick glance, posture loosened and voices got louder than they normally would have with Aizawa in the room. It was like with this new assured freedom they had lost all inhibitions regarding secrecy or seriousness. Not to say his teammates didn't act like relieved teenagers. It would be suspicious if they didn't. No. Instead they were slightly more reserved, letting the heroes drown them out. It was tense around the back of the room though, with 3 of the hero council so close to a primary suspect for villain leader. He'd apologized profusely to Momo, but the girl had taken it in stride, saying by having the attention on her he'd be able to drop more hints about the credibility of leadership for other people, confusing the heroes even more. It was an incredible idea. Just one of the many reasons he had Momo in his inner circle. Their leadership system was relatively similar to the heroes, but instead of having a 4-person council with Todoroki as the deciding vote, from what Koji had told them at least, The villain team had him as leader, with Hitoshi as his second with Mei, Mezu, Kendo, Momo as his counsel. The idea was he'd make ideas, run them through Hitoshi who would give his opinion before they were ran through those four, and after they were tweaked they'd decide whether or not to go through with it. It seemed lengthy and overcomplicated, but it allowed for him to get his plans critiqued so someone could tell him if he was going too far. And then the council was to see if it was manageable. Of course, some of his plans he'd initiated outright. Another reason for council was so he could have squads. They would train to work together efficiently, even if some of their teammates were people they would never have thought to work with before. Mei's team consisted of her, Sin, Yosetsu, Juzo, Denki and Mina. All of their quirks could be applied to both combat but also defensive maneuvers. The plus was that, with the exception of Mince unless you worked on something ridiculous, they could all be applied to manufacturing or mechanics. Momo's team consisted of her, Rikido, Yuga, Nito and Kyoka. With that setup you had a mix of long-range and close-range capabilities, plus Nito had a range of quirks to copy depending on what kind of support was required. Another plus to that team was that Momo and Rikido both needed sugar and fats for their quirk to work, so if they kept that requirement contained to one team the flow of resources could be controlled. There was risk there of course, of they were both together and ran out of sugar fats, but there wasn't much to be done. Kendo had taken a different approach to her fellow council members, deciding to go for a stockpile of tactile quirks rather than outright defensive or offensive quirks, with her team consisting of her, Setsuna, Toru and Mashiaro. This combination of quirks all required some element of stealth or surprise due to either the nature of the quirk or the finicky nature in which to use it. After all, Setsuna and Toru were much more stealth-based with their quirks complementing this with minimal visibility. Whereas, Mashiaro had a long tail on him and Kendo's hands became massive. They weren't exactly able to use their quirks in broad daylight without drawing suspicion. And then Mezu's team. He'd been worried at the lineup, feeling that maybe the members felt outcast from the other groups. Thankfully he'd been proved wrong when it turned out Mezu had created his team first out of all of them. Him, Fumikage, Koji, Reiko and Kuroro. All tricky quirks, versatile yes but not exactly put to the forefront when people thought hero course. Their abilities were proven however with the sole fact they were in those classes. Mezu himself was a powerhouse of pure muscle and coupled with Dark Shadow's raw strength it would be an amazing team-up. As well as Fumikage and Kuroro teaming up Dark Shadow could be at full potential during the daylight. He felt particularly happy with Koji and Reiko being on the same team. He knew the girl wouldn't admit it but the concentration her quirk too made her uneasy when using it. He'd witnessed that firsthand during training the night before. However, with Koji on hand with insects and animals at the ready, some of the pressure would be off of the girl. He and Hitoshi didn't have specific teams, as they were in possession of quirks that didn't particularly fit into the image or gimmick of the other teams. Everyone was training to be able to work with everybody else, despite teams, so them not having a team didn't matter too much. Anyway, he had miniature teams within teams anyway. For example, Fumikage and Kuroro, Momo and Nito and Denki and Mina. That was just 3 examples of the duos he'd set up. They'd need to be able to work in smaller groups depending on what their bonus points were, speaking of which he was supposed to get the list of objectives at some point today. That's the first PRD bell, off you go. He attempted to hide his excitement but he wasn't really trying too hard as he stood up and threw his bag over his shoulder. He made sure to be out of the class as quickly as possible. He needed to know whether Snipe-sensei was in a lesson or was willing to teach them how to handle firearms during school hours. Midoriya. Looking over his shoulder as he speed-walked through the corridor, he spotted Ida and Uraraka following behind him speedily. It looked to physically pain Ida to come so close to running in the hallway. Deku, please wait, we just want to talk. He sped UPS jogging now and heard a very shocked Uraraka and checked to see the brunette running after him. Picking up his own pace he got to the two-way split. So, that won't work this time, Deku. He could hear the girl behind him and unlike last time he didn't resist the urge to jump on the banister and slide down that. He let out a whoop as the sharp angle sent him speeding down one flight of stairs. Jumping off before he crashed, he took off down the corridor to the next set of stairs and repeated the process before getting to the floor with the teacher's lounge on it. Knocking on the door, acutely aware of Uraraka's out-of-breath yell of his name, he waited until a teacher opened it. Midnight was the one to open the door, looking down at him with a curious yet expectant look. Midoriya? Is Snipe-sensei here, Midnight-sensei? Or is he teaching? She paused, looking over her shoulder, and turned to answer before hearing a shout of his name just as he did. This time it was much closer and Uraraka didn't sound so out of breath. He just hoped the rest of the team had taken the scramble approach at his lead. The point was to confuse the heroes as to where they were going so that if anyone communicated and said one person was acting suspicion for going in the wrong direction, it would quickly become apparent that no one was going in a singular direction. Come in, Midoriya. Snipe is at his desk. As he was ushered into the room, he smiled at her and thanked her. Making his way into the teacher's lounge, he realized it was nothing more than a glorified office, with each teacher having a desk and a singular coffee table and couch. He hid his smile as the teachers desperately tried to hide All Might's haggard form from his eyes, even though for someone that wasn't already in the know that would have grabbed their attention even more. He approached Snipe's desk and waited for the teacher to look up. Oh, hello Midoriya. Don't tell me Aizawa forgot classes are cancelled this week. No, Sensei already told us about that. I was wondering about the lessons we agreed on. Are we still doing them after school, or could we just shadow your classes? He couldn't tell exactly what the man was thinking, due to his mask obscuring his entire expression, but from the way the papers in his hands were put down and a finger tapped a tune out on the desk, he could tell he was thinking about it. It is true that the second years have just started gun safety and combat use, and it would mean I wouldn't have to lose hours every night. He couldn't help the grin that threatened to split his features. Alright. I have classes through second to last PRD. They're all beginners, as support also learn it as well, so different groups each time would suffice. Great. Can I please use my phone to contact my group? Sure, kid. A hand was waved dismissively, but as he turned and phoned May, he wasn't ignorant to the curious look his teacher had on him. He supposed it was acceptable as the villain team had probably never seemed so invested before. Hey, I just get us permission to shadow Snipe-sensei's lessons for today. Could you get everyone to start organizing themselves into teams? We have parameters to keep within people. We mess this opening up, all our plans go down the drain. Got it, boss? Was choruses over the comms, and he flicked his eyes from screen to screen. There were quite a few variables here that could send this whole scheme tumbling down with the slightest of breezes. However, he had 2, 3 if he counted the backup plans running right now. He was playing the long run here. Each step was carefully articulated and planned to effect down the line. Even the way he had his explosives sloppily placed and just within the safety limits to allow them to have them put up on his distraction would affect later on. For exam, the heroes would think they didn't know what they were doing with the explosives, and when the well-hidden, perfectly placed and crafted bombs would go off later into the exercise, they'd have no idea what they were dealing with. Who's it feel, boss? We have the whole world at our feet. He smiled. Shinsu's tone was cocky as he grew into the role he'd been set. A Yakuza boss was nothing without his right hand, and Shinso filled the role well. I say we send a welcome card. Oh. He cracked his knuckles. We managed to grab the fake objective, right? At a nod he continued, I say we cut the robot's head off and deliver it to the hero's front door. We aren't supposed to know where each other's bases are. Psychologically throw them off, get them paranoid from the get-go. Sure you don't want to let them feel easy and then pull the rug out. We can do both. He stood and turned to his friend, seeing the mask and hood of the costume hiding any distinguishing features. Scare them, let them think they're winning, and then we hit them twice as hard as before. Shinso finished for him, sounding remarkably amused and smug despite the lack of indication from his features. Izuku could almost guess he was smiling. Then, the tone returned to normal. You doing good? Yeah. He smiled, also returning to normal. I've got probably a few days of this mindset before I start to feel shitty and start considering killing everyone and myself. Cool. A hand patted him on the shoulder and the tilt of Shinsu's masked face indicated a sheet-eating grin. I'm gonna go prepare our surprise. Any preference on how they get it? It's a welcoming gift, Wakagashira, let's go in with a bang. Of course, Kumicho. It's the day of the exam and still, nobody knows who the villain leader is. They know who's on the team from their class and the most obvious choice would be Deku, but it's Aizawa who's picked the captains. He wouldn't go for something so obvious. When they stand in the briefing room, watching the feed from security cameras that picked up the villain's activity, there isn't much indication to who's in charge. All the villains are wearing masks and hoods with dark baggy clothing that hides any identifying features. Tako can only spot Shoji from the rest because he's simply too tall to be anyone else. But then her eyes slide to another screen and she sees variation in the costumes. There are still masks and hoods, but instead of jumpsuits reminiscent of Aizawa-sensei's, there are business suits, formal dresses, pencil skirts. The group coming out of the second van look like officer workers except the hoods tucked into their blazers and the masks on their faces don't give anything away. She hadn't realized how small the villain group was until after 3 vans in they see no more arriving. Something's wrong. Todoroki sounds tense as he speaks and she turns her eyes to her leader, seeing how still he is. The numbers don't add up. Out of the 2 classes participating, everyone has been accounted for, but there's too many people on the villain team. Defectors? Ida's suggestion is met with quiet, and Ochako, despite her better judgment, finds herself eyeing Class 1B for anyone who looks suspicious or who she thinks could turn. The idea to suspect her own classmates rises before ducking its head. They're all here because they didn't want to be on the villain team. She trusted each and every one of her 1A teammates. She needed to stop being paranoid. Against the rules. All players are registered with the teachers before the exam. The teachers would have pulled it up. Besides, our numbers are the same as when we entered. Todoroki has a way of speaking, Ochako realizes, that lets her relax and trust his judgment. So you noticed? The screens that had each showed different CCTV footage turned to static before each screen started to flicker, becoming one part of a greater image. A mask, and she noticed this one had more of a flourish to it than the others the villains had wearing, appeared. No face, no body, just an image of a mask and a distorted voice. Well done, Todoroki. Sorry, the disembodied voice chuckled and it sounded broken and glitchy. Hero Captain Shudo. But good job on counting our numbers. You'll remember this is a year-wide assessment. There was a moment of silence where nobody said anything because it struck them that they had forgotten that part. The leader of the villains had taken advantage of that, had probably known they would stick to Hero Corps students, preferring to know their teammates could fight. She didn't realize that she privately thought someone from another course would be a dead weight, and continued listening. My friends are rather unique. As is our little band of renegades. I think you'll come to see that soon. But oh, look at the time. Why did they sound amused? You'll be getting a welcome gift from us soon. Better hurry, you don't want to miss the show. With that, the screens shut off, static being bypassed for black screens, and as one of 1B scrambled to fix it, she heard a shout of frustration. The wires had been severed somehow, seconds after the footage had ended. That meant it was someone in their team. Be on the lookout, we have an intruder. Then she relaxed because, of course, this was to get them wound up. Someone on the hero team had probably stalked their convoy and had hidden in the building in order to do this. Of course. A knock at the door made them freeze. It was only Bakugo, who had been silent and simply watching for the duration of their exercise, who dared go to the door. When he got there, hand going off in explosions, he ripped the door open and there was simply a package. Nothing more, no person, no note, simply a box. It heightened the belief that there was an intruder. She didn't remember ever seeing Hagakure at their training sessions, so she was probably responsible. The box was brought in, dumped on the table for all to see, scratchy hand writing on the lid of the box reading, "To be opened in front of everybody." And opened it them did. Ochako wished they hadn't. Broken in and ripped to near disfigurement was the head of an All Might bot, the former grinning smile looking dastardly and dead in its smashed-up state. It unnerved her. The All Might bots were failsafes. The teacher's way of controlling a situation should it get too dire. For it to be this broken. There's something else, Karo. Sue's words were loud above the unconscious rumble they'd all adopted. Nobody seemed to dare to speak over a whisper, and at Sue's words all eyes landed on a playing card tucked face down into a split in the robot's skull. The frog girl reached in for it, though Todoroki putting a hand in front stopped her. Why would they want us all to see this and then leave such an obvious clue with everyone surrounding it in a small space unless it was a trap? For F's sake, icy hot, just take the diamond card. I'm getting sick of waiting around. I'll take it out myself if I have to. Eyes split between the blonde and bichromatic leader, waiting to see what the judgment would be. Everyone but Bakugo out of the room. In case it is a trap, we don't need everyone going down. They agree, and as they leave the room, Ochako spies the way Bakugo's hands tense, clenching and unclenching as he stares at the box as if he wants nothing more than to throw it away and not see what calling card awaits him. They close the floor behind them. There isn't nearly as much room as they need there to be, but there's nothing they can do. From the silence in the corridor, it's easy to hear the sliding of the card from the metal, and then it's silent again. Someone swears, from 1B she thinks, she isn't paying attention to anything but what happens next, as Bakugo laughs. A loud, angry, venomous laugh that carries years of disdain. The door is opened and she feels her stomach drop a bit at the card. The King of Hearts isn't immediately recognizable, it's only for the K and heart on it that she recognizes the placement of it in the deck. In place of the traditional European medieval figure sits a masked figure lounging on a throne, indescript weapon hanging loosely in their grip. On the bottom of the card, where the king is usually reflected, is the same figure, with the same weapon, but this time the blank mask is blood-splattered and the throne is gone. She isn't sure what it is about the card that sets her off. Perhaps it's the amount of detail in it that makes her heart go a mile a minute. Receiving the confirmation that the hero team had received their surprise, he gets Toru, or rather Mirror, to return to base. While he'd love to have the invisible girl snoop around, due to the hierarchy system, Koji's position as a spy was precarious and information was sure to be spotty at times. He didn't know what Todoroki had up his sleeve. For all his planning, analysis, and countermeasures, Todoroki was still a wild card. Silent and powerful, Izuku found it difficult to get in his head. And because of that, many of the countermeasures he had for his rival were mere speculation. Sure, Todoroki had poor control of his fire, but he demonstrated he had enough control to not burn him to a crisp during the sports festival. That level of control, despite years of rejection of the quirk, meant that all he needed was fine-tuning to be a dangerous enemy. And having seen what he'd done with Stain, that was enough to worry him. Besides, Mirror wasn't just a pawn. Someone to throw away, expendable. She was his teammate. Someone he trusted and needed. He wasn't about to throw her under the bus like that. Not in such an unstable situation such as this. Boss, we have a progress report on the council building. Breaking from his thoughts, he turned his attention to the security screen showing the body camera footage from Addict. The team were stood across from what looked like an ornate door, the carvings of birds and flowers looking suspiciously Western. What is it, drivers? Were the blueprints wrong? He did have a feeling, one he couldn't shake no matter how much he tried to rationalize, that just maybe Nizu had put fake blueprints where he could find them. No, nothing like that, boss. It's just well, this is the pickup. He saw the door open on the feed and nearly choked on air when he saw what was sat behind the door. Vlad-sensei is going to love this. Sat there, reclined and looking at peace as much as a robot could, was a Vlad King imitation eating out of a flowery, pink bento box. The box was stamped in a deep, bold scarlet with the number 5. Seeing the door stay open and the robot take no interest in his team, he spoke. I think you should play the waiting game here. Sit in the office, and if the robot doesn't respond, watch its movements. If there's even a second that box is unattended, snatch it and run. They'd been pushing it by demolishing an all-might bot. Needless destruction was only appropriate in certain circumstances, and now wasn't one of them. Only destroy the bot if A, it notices and becomes hostile, or B, if by lunch it hasn't left it unattended. Got it, boss? Addict signing out. Mezu let out a silent sigh as he watched his teammates shift in. Their places outside the ornate room. Their expressions were hidden behind white oval masks, near blank and designed to stop any form of identification. The masks were different for each group, and he found that that was a good choice. as each style of mask was then differentiated in the slightest of ways so each person could be individual while the heroes remained none the wiser. For instance, Fumicage's mask had crossed katanas as the main decorative aspect, however the katana's indent was covered in a shimmering black film, allowing for the boy's gothic flair to have an outlet without immediately letting on who he was. Apparently it had been Mina who had suggested the color, as well as that the girl had been the one to make the appropriate adjustments so that dark shadow wouldn't be crushed under the layers of fabric. He had known Izuku was a good option. The boy often did think of everything. But he'd come to learn that his classmates, people he never would have dreamt of talking to, were all just as powerful in their own right. He would have to thank Izuku for opening his eyes after the exercise was over. "You heard the boss, let's get this show on the road." He heard a snicker from Shadow and was about to ask why when the quiet girl answered unprompted. "They captured Sensei perfectly." Shudo felt a headache coming on, and seeing as it was only an hour into the exam he was ready to raise a few issues with the whole thing. First issue, the villains seemed to be 5 steps ahead. They'd been allowed in first, instead of both teams entering simultaneously. They were also apparently in the know of where the hero base was even though that was supposed to be undisclosed information. And that was his biggest issue. Because it raised a variety of questions. Were the villain team being given this information by the teachers? Had the villains been given special access to the training ground? Had his team been missing out on things, or was it biased? Surely though, he reasoned, the heroes would be the biased side. In what little he'd heard about this exercise it was also controversially received, so his reasoning could have flaws in it. Simultaneously though, he liked to believe that Midoriya would have told him that his friend would have foregone team loyalties and have shared any information he had. But then his thoughts drifted to the argument he and Ida had stumbled upon, and despite the awkward way their friend received them, Shudo had recognized the determination in the boy's voice. It was the same way he'd told him his quirk was his own. That was why he knew the thought that Midoriya would have told him any extra information was a pipe dream. Clearly Midoriya had something to prove, something that went beyond Yaezu, whatever it was though it didn't make him dangerous. The boy didn't have much control over his quirk, no matter the improvement between the sports festival and post-apprenticeships, and that meant that Midoriya wouldn't be a heavy hitter. He'd be a foot soldier, or more likely he'd be tucked away at home base doing something with his analysis. Sho too had never been more relieved for his unreadable expressions when he'd discovered Midoriya's notebooks on the class. It unnerved him, but Midoriya didn't have it in him to exploit friends' weaknesses. He'd seen that on the second day of term with Bakugu, who he had a terrible relationship. He'd been interested in the match between the #1 candidate from the entrance exam and the boy who broke his bones and had been considered virtually useless by their teacher. He hadn't been disappointed. It was clear, to him at least, that Midoriya could read Bakugu like an open book. His demonstration in the first few minutes were enough to testify that. What had sold it though was how, even when overwhelmed by a barrage on all sides by the blonde Midoriya, had still managed to get what he wanted in the end. Though he'd seen that the boy was essentially holding back. If he was able to take down Bakugu in mere seconds, why had he allowed himself to be tossed around like a rag doll? He wouldn't. That was how Shudo had come to the conclusion that Midoriya, despite being capable of tearing someone down, couldn't bring himself to do it. Bakuga's lamination after the fact that stupid Deku could have dodged, the fucker just wanted sympathy, only added to his theory. That was why, despite knowing how clinically Midoriya could take a person's quirk apart, he wasn't worried. Deku had demonstrated he couldn't hurt people close to him. It wasn't in the boy's nature trick and deceive. Switching from the driver's team comms, Izuku switched to the team's overall channel. He knew Evangelion was monitoring this from her truck, driven by Gio, who apparently had jumped at the chance to be an espionage driver, but he felt better keeping an eye on everyone. This way it would take less time if he needed to walk a team through a countermeasure they may not have down 100%. It was a precaution he hoped would be needless. It was slightly hypnotic listening to the inconsistent strings of chatter, of quips and of sighs and grunts of frustration that he asked about and helped fix issues. So far there hadn't been hero interference, but he figured that was because they were going for small-scale objectives. A street sign, a pen from a bank, documents from flats. Nothing major, The most high-risk item they were currently going for was the Vlad replica's bento box, which was housed in the fake city's city hall. But even that was nothing compared to some of the other objectives he'd seen on the list. A nuclear reactor from a research lab. The life of the city's mayor. A specific painting in a museum. And that was to name 3. The objectives were bonuses, so technically they could go through the entire game without bothering with them. However, Izuku had a hunch that if they were to do that and the game ended in a tie, somehow, the winners would end up being the heroes. It would most likely be on a technicality that while it was a tie, the villains had technically not scored any points, while the heroes had, specifically because one of the objectives was in their base, meaning they held the points for that object. He had to admit, having their spy's room nameplate as an objective was incredibly sneaky and ingenious. Prompts to Nizu for figuring out how to hide that one in plain sight. It had helped he guessed that apparently every number in the hero base was a different color, the only one being the shade of scarlet that signified an objective being the Piper's room. We have the bento box boss, but we have another problem. He was broken out of his lull, for the second time that day by the same team no less, by the worried yet level tone of Shadow's voice. Sending a quick message Wakagashira's way to switch the cameras to his computer, Izuku turned all the cameras to the ones that gave him the best angles of the drivers. As he did, he hissed out a curse under his breath. Standing there, hands blazing with explosives, was Bakugo, standing with him was Tetsu and Kirishima. All 3 heavy hitters against a team that was made up of 1 lone heavy hitter and 3 long to mid-range fighters. Not to mention Eldritch's quirk did not mix well with Bakugo's. Hopefully Blanc would be able to compensate. Alright, there's only the 3 of them. His eyes scanned camera angles and searched for any chance that he may be incorrect as he spoke. Blanc and Eldritch, I need you to tag team on this. Bakugo's quirk will be an immediate counter to Eldritch and the BS star D knows it. Hitoshi is concerned when all he receives from Kumicho is a quick message saying to take over surveillance for him. However, the fact that it's such a quick, frantic message has him not questioning and not taking over. He turns his comms on, sliding the headset on and standing from his seat and walking to the glass top table in the center of the room. Once there, he taps it, the 3D holographic map of the city shining to life before his eyes. Each team has a different color and a different amount of rots depending on where they are. He can tell immediately who the drivers are because 1 yellow dot resides on the hero base. But disregarding that, knowing that the Piper was where he was supposed to be, he tapped the table again, seeing all the security cameras come up in front of him. He swipes all but the ones for the drivers away. Okay, he's on the team-wide comms so he knows the other 3 teams can hear him. I'm taking over for Kumicho. The drivers have experienced a road bump. Everybody's main objectives are to get the payload and get out. He taps the table, muting the mic for a second and using voice command to get the cameras for the sewers up as well, before continuing, the sewers are everybody's best bet, we don't know how or why they're at City Hall so discretion is key. There's a round of confirmations, don't be surprised if you get called for combat, though, that may be left to you to Geo, Evangelion. Izuku isn't stressed per se, rather a bit set off that the first little plan he had to have this outcome. He wouldn't have minded if anyone else had turned up. It was the fact it was Bakugo and the Punch-Out duo. Bakugo knew how to undermine Eldritch's quirk, which meant Blanc would have to provide support. There wasn't even a point in entertaining the idea of Bakugo going for anyone else first. He'd go for the person he knew he could beat down easiest. And because of this, that meant that Shadow and Cleaner would be dealing with the Punch-Out duo. He didn't doubt that Cleaner could possibly handle both of them, but Shadow wouldn't be ignored. It was really biting them in the arse now that the 2 didn't care about fighting girls in combat, and her quirk would not work in this situation. He knew for a fact the 2 were above her threshold. However, that she could cause distractions, throw them, quite literally, off their game. Okay, Shadow, Cleaner, you're going against Kirishima and Tetsu. Shadow, can you try and create a distraction? Throw furniture, bins etc. While Cleaner approaches them head-on. They're right outside the building, right? Why are we leading them into the building? That's putting us in danger. It's risky, I know. But this way Geo can offer an escape route without having to run Kirishima and Tetsu over. Wait, I have the option to run them over? The tank can handle it, Kumicho. We could do that. He hears a few more agreements, and as he issues them to get ready to defend, he runs through the risks in his head, the escape routes open and such, and he finds a rueful smile coming onto his face. Leave it to him to turn heroes in training into people more than ready to run over their peers. All right, Geo, you're clear to run them down. Shadow, Cleaner, Eldritch, Blanc hold off the opposition until help arrives. He feels himself getting giddy. Evangelion feel free to fire at will. Geo use escape route G7 once the pickup has been received. I'll send a team to create a diversion on their way back to base. All he hears in the next 10 minutes are Bakuga's explosions being promptly cut off by a horn going ba-ba-da-ba-ba-ba, and the shout of pure confusion and adrenaline-filled joy as Tetsu and Kirishima are ruthlessly run down by Geo. Nothing personal, fellas. Is called out as he switches to Hitoshi and asks him to have Muscle's squad bar mirror, 'cause havoc on their side of town. What do you have in mind? We're never gonna need that office building again, right? Plus we're talking realism. Make it a bad one. He can hear the glee and envision the smirk. They'll be dragging bodies out of there for weeks. It's not scary. Uraraka is scared right now as she stands in front of the destroyed building. It's on fire, and there are freighter bots at work to make sure it doesn't spread to nearby buildings, and the rubble from the explosion is scattered for the next block and a half. It knocks her to her very core as she stands in front of the building, and there are bots that pretend to be survivors, that pretend to be grieving family members who came as soon as they saw it on the news, and there are police officer bots taking statements and trying to console the relatives. All of it is too realistic. It's like one villain attack she remembers from when she was younger. She had supposed to have been in bed hours previous, but she'd waited for the moment she knew she could get away with it to get out of bed and sneak into the corridor. She'd stuck her head into the living room, wondering why the TV was still on, but at such a low volume. It was regretted ever since. The sight of a decimated building and grieving people haunted her. And now it was happening before her eyes. Uravity. She looks over at a girl from 1B, what was her name again? And watches as a sad smile that shows the same level of fear she's feeling. It's fine. They're just robots, remember? And as she looks back at the robots, she can't help but disagree. It doesn't matter that they're just robots, because if a person could so sloppily, and the sloppiness caused a great impact than was probably ever intended, destroy such realistic-looking robots. What were they willing to do to an actual human? At noon, the villain team sit down for lunch. All the members, bar one, are present and they seem to be enjoying themselves. Laughing, joking, and acting like teenagers. The only thing off about the situation is the outfits. Jumpsuits that hide defining body characteristics and masks to hide appearances, suits that mimic Yakuza clothing, large hoods tucked into the collars with surgical masks and goggles, and then more suits, but these are older, more Western PRD drama style. A plague doctor's mask goes with that attire. But nobody wears their mask here. All are sat around in a circle on the floor with bento boxes and their masks and hoods down and around their necks. It's relaxed, happy even. Izuku smiles as he watches his teammates talk strategy, joke about their next villainous act, and returns to his food. Tenya has to help carry Tetsu and Kirishima into the hospital ward in their building when the pair arrive. Accompanying him are Koda, Todoroki, and Siro. Everybody else is either out or rushing to the hospital ward to get it set up. He's hiding the shaking of his hands as he keeps his classmate upright. Even with his hardened form activated, he can see the substantial damage done to the pair. What happened to you? They ran us over. What? Tetsu, who watches Kirishima like a hawk, seemingly knowing that metal holds up a hell of a lot better to a moving vehicle than rock, answers, it was a head-on collision. This guy with a plague mask ran us down without any hesitation. Shaking hands are not the only thing Tenya has to suppress now. His anger and fear has joined the list. Mezu lets out a laugh, a type of laugh he hasn't let out since before he got his quirk, and keeps relaxing as Nito sets off in a fit of laughter also. It only gets worse as their group, him, Nito, Kyoka, Yuga, and Kendo all devolve into pure laughter. He isn't even sure why he's laughing by the end of it, but he's so happy that he doesn't care. Watching security cameras for the city, Shudo clenches his teeth at the sight of the villain team mercilessly holding the office building for no reason, or no reason that the cameras picked up, before planting explosives. And then the building blows up. It's a fiery inferno with a light so intense it lights up the once dark room instantly. Bakugo next to him swears, "A regular occurrence, but it seems worse now." "How many casualties were there?" he asks, and the blonde seems to find it hard to get the words out. "They don't know. The bot said they'll be digging out bodies for weeks." Due to the disarray they'd caused in the early hours of the exam, the hero team were fully occupied, rescuing and helping with the cleanup of their office building display. The look on Kendo's face when they'd come in from setting the explosives had made him regret the action, but the way the Class 1B rep squared her shoulders and told herself more than him that she just needed to view it as a lesson lessened the guilt slightly. It was a lesson in the fact that villains didn't care. Just as she didn't have to feel guilty because they were robots, villains wouldn't feel guilty because to them the lives of others were irrelevant. "Still," he pushed onwards, keeping his voice steady as he crouched in front of where she was sat against the wall, "I'm sorry I asked you to do that. Would you have gone out and set the explosives up if I'd have said I couldn't do it?" "Yes." Her eyes snap up at him, and he smiles genuinely. "You're my teammate, my friend Kendo. If you can't do something, tell me next time and we'll find a way around it." She laughs. What was plan B in this situation? He drops to his backside instead of crouching, plant the bombs on fire hydrants and just flood downtown. Yet that wouldn't have been half as effective at scaring them. No, if you need a bit before going back in the field, you can just say you know. Nobody is going to judge you for it. He realizes how hypocritical that is to say. How many times has he gone out and done stupid shit when he shouldn't have? Is it scary? Coming up with these plans? Her eyes don't meet his anymore and her tone is hesitant. Terrifying. Some days I lay in bed and just think. I just think about what a monster I am. He sees her sneaking glances at him and so continues. But then I think that as long as I never intentionally hurt people, they're just intrusive thoughts, you know? She's silent and then, "You're not a monster." Pulling himself to his feet, he holds his hand out to pull her up. "Let's see how long you think that." "So boss, what's our next cause of action?" Everyone has piled into the meeting room, and Hitoshi stands by his side with the holographic map of the city lit up in front of them. He lets his eyes survey the map as he talks. "Well, we've got 4 objectives, correct?" With a swipe of the hand there are markers on the map where the 4 obtained objectives had been, and we know where the hero base is, so the only thing I can see at the moment is getting more objectives and causing panic where we can. He pauses, lets it sink in, and there's a general sound of agreement, and he almost holds off on what he says next, almost. "It's come to my attention some of you are uncomfortable with some of the plans. That's fine." Faces that had dropped twist in confusion. "I know I'm asking a lot from you. If you can't go through with stuff, tell me. Some of the stuff is intense." Juzo's voice is quiet, but he's heard perfectly in the quiet room. "But I signed up knowing I'd be doing things I wouldn't always morally agree with. But that's just part of it, isn't it?" "Yes." He rubs the back of his neck. "But at the end of the day, you're people, you have feelings. And I don't want you guys sitting there and regretting doing something." It is once again silent, and it seems everybody here has finally realized that what they're doing is real. It will hurt their classmates, their friends, it will scare them, it won't ever be the right thing to do. "I won't regret anything." Reiko's voice bounces practically around the room as everyone holds their breath, nervous for what she has to say. "I'm never going to have another opportunity to show that I can win. And besides, real-life villains wouldn't go easy, so why should we?" There seems to be a universal agreement to what she said, and Izuku lightly grasps Hitoshi's clenched fist at his side and squeezes it. The boy relaxes slightly and Izuku smiles at him. He knows what Reiko means, and he understands why Hitoshi is getting so angry. It isn't fair, it really isn't, that there are people who feel so inadequate because of their quirks. In Reiko's case, she should feel proud, should feel almighty and powerful. But because of how UA's system works, she doesn't. She feels weak, she feels like she's never going to have an opportunity to prove herself. For Hitoshi, to have a quirk that made you a powerhouse but then be treated like a disgrace was a very real thing for him. It was a testament to his morals, his conscience and his self-control that he'd dealt with years of being told a villain, and instead of giving in, he'd gone to UA as the biggest middle finger he could give to his old classmates. But Izuku also understood this need to win. It was something that had always haunted him. To win was to feel like you could do something well. And to feel that meant you could improve yourself. And the idea that a quirkless kid could improve themselves and go up and up and up was almost unheard of. To him, that maybe the reason his plans included him using his quirk so little was because he wanted to prove it could be done. He wasn't stupid. He knew the teachers had to have figured it out. If they knew about All Might's quirk, it was only logical to assume they knew he was looking for a successor, and in lieu of a search inside school, that he was the successor. That's what I was hoping you'd say. He chuckled and his team joined with him, attention dripping from their shoulders nobody had noticed before. I understand your devotion and I support it, but I was beginning serious. If you can't go through with something, we'll try and work around it. Yuga tried to stop the bouncing of his knee as he sat in the back of the truck. He, Apollo, White Collar, Addict and Hephaestus were quiet as Torch drove them to their heist. Evangelion was sat across from them, tapping away at her laptop with a serious expression on her face, it being only partially hidden by the medical mask she had on. Her goggles were pushed up to the crown of her head. He tried to go through the plan in his head again and found, irritatingly, that he couldn't. He gave up on keeping his legs still, glad his mask hid his expression as Apollo's head turned in his direction. It was embarrassing to ask for the plan to be explained again. It was, however, dangerous, never mind counterproductive, to enter a sensitive situation without the plan in his mind. He just didn't want to admit he was having difficulty remembering. It had always been like that, though, he mused. Everyone else just seemed to get things. And no, he wasn't stupid or lacking in intelligence, but sometimes it just took a while for things to click. Growing up, he'd hidden it behind gaudy smiles and over-extravagance. At least that way people wouldn't care if he didn't seem to be paying attention. He was just too busy internally stressing to ever look it. They'd just chalk it up to him being an airhead. He hated that was what he'd fallen to, but he'd done what he'd had to. At the very least, Hephaestus and Kumicho thought he still had some use, so he had that going for him. Nova. Coming back into the present, he nodded towards Hephaestus to let her know he was listening. He hid a flinch when she sighed. What if she stopped thinking he was useful? We're going through the plan once again. Apollo said she wasn't 100%. Do you mind? He was glad his mask covered his face, because otherwise they'd have seen the watering of his eyes. Before this exercise started, he didn't have many friends, but Apollo had been one of the few. He knew she has a near photographic memory. Of course, I don't mind at all. It's best to keep it fresh in our minds after all. He could swear his team leader was smiling, and the scrunch of Evangelion's eyebrows certainly told him she was. He sits attentive as the two leaders go over the intricacies of the plan. This time he manages to get his parts memorized and the important parts down, and like everybody else pretends to not notice Apollo giving his hand a reassuring squeeze. She says nothing when he squeezes it back, so he accepts that she understands. Itsuka holds her breath in for a few more seconds than she normally would before releasing it as she stands next to Cleaner. The taller boy has improved hearing, she knows, and is grateful that all he does is send her a raised eyebrow. She isn't sure how to feel about the situation. She hasn't been treated like she's fragile, it's more like all the other leaders. Kumicho and Wakigashira had a meeting without her. She feels out of the loop, and it's not clear to her how to feel about that. Should she be annoyed? Should she be grateful? Should she be worried? Is she paranoid? No, she pushes that thought away. The first step to being paranoid is feeling like you might be being paranoid. She was just curious. Curious as to the peculiar feeling of exclusion she was experiencing. They're testing the waters tonight. After the destruction of the office building, they weren't sure how the heroes would respond. The Piper was in a precarious position due to the hero's politics and couldn't relay information much because he simply wasn't being given it. The heroes were being kept nearly 100% in the dark at any given point, which, she supposed, was a good tactic against espionage, as was being seen with the Piper. However, it had its flaws. Such as, how was the team supposed to trust its leaders if they were nothing more than pawns of a chessboard? She knew why Kumicho wasn't going on missions left and right in this plan because, as he'd explained, the king lost value the more it was played offensively. As long as Kumicho remained an anonymous entity to the opposition, they had an element of surprise. It was a level of secrecy that made her head work over time. But it was better than not knowing where you were from one minute to the next. She could agree with Kumicho on that point that it wouldn't take long for the heroes to start to destroy themselves. A chain was only as strong as its weakest link. If the foot soldiers, she'd originally hated the term being used to describe her friends, but the more she learnt about the Piper's situation, the more apparent it was becoming that that was the right term, didn't know where to shoot, then the generals had little to no chance of doing anything but shooting their own men. She knew Kumicho already had a plan in place for such a situation. She looked over to the holographic table in the center of the room where Wakagashira was going through security cameras and sees the office building still in flames even all these hours later. Itsuka feels a shiver rack up her spine at the mere memory of what she'd done. The robots' faces had been so realistic, the simulated crying and begging, the sound of shattering windows and the deafening boom of the actual explosion. She realizes she's not disgusted with the action itself, but more that she felt adrenaline, a strange kind of joy and excitement at the whole experience. She'd enjoyed it. That's what she'd hated about the whole experience. She'd enjoyed having power, having the ability to say no, having the ability to be in control, to be powerful. It was dangerously intoxicating, and that's why she felt so awful. Because she'd accepted what she'd done and knew she'd do it again. Shaking her head, she turned back to where Cleaner was talking through a headset and keeping his eyes on the screens for the sewers. Geo, Mole, Zombie and Demo Woman were all on screen, collapsing certain paths and opening brand new ones that only they would know about. She found it amazing seeing Geo use his softening quirk to make the wall partially permeable, creating a fake wall of sorts that you could pass through into a tunnel. From inside the main tunnel it was a regular wall, not even looking discolored. However, if you pushed your body weight into it, you would sink through the goo-like consistency of the wall into the new tunnel. The best part was the way they were constructing the walls meant that it put itself right back into place as soon as you stepped through it. That meant that if worst came to worst, they could make quick escapes and bamboozle the heroes doing it. With Evangelion and Hepistus out on a job and Cleaner next to her running the cleanup crew, as they were apparently affectionately naming their builders and redesigners, she was left as the only council member that didn't have a job. Wakagashira was reviewing all the footage with the heroes in it to see how they responded to certain events. She could offer to help, but the 1C student looked pensive as he stared at the cameras. She didn't really want to get between him and whatever was grating on his nerves. Kumicho was who knows where, so she couldn't even just head up to the control room and receive orders because there was no guarantee he was even in there. Plus, just wandering off felt wrong, but so did loitering as her teammates did work. This lack of anything to do made her certain her other leaders had all grouped together and discussed strategy and excluded her. The thought set her off. Why was she being left out? She could contribute. She was just as competent as any other leader here. In fact, aside from Hepistus, she is probably the most qualified here, being the class rep of 1B. Sure, she was shaken and in a bit of a rut at the moment. And sure, she felt like she was splitting at the seams because of inner moral turmoil less than an hour ago. But that was no reason that she couldn't be doing something. Standing, loitering, and not contributing racked her nerves and made everything 10 times worse. Hey, muscle? Jerking to the left, it took her a minute to realize who had called her. From Mirror's laugh, she figured she hadn't been rude by literally not seeing her in the doorway. Yeah. Is something up? No, yes. The tone would fit a sheepish grin. Could you come help Blanc and I? Everyone else was training and we thought we'd make dinner, but we forgot why we had certain people who would cook. Laughing, she imagined what mess Blanc had made this time around. Sure, I'll be right there. You haven't seen boss, have you? The pause between the question and the response went to set her off, but that cue as quickly averted when the girl answered, That's the reason we asked you. Boss kind of just got some cleaning supplies out and started cleaning, and we're almost too afraid to go in there. The shift of clothing made it seem like a full body shiver had racked through the girl. I don't get how he makes a mop look dangerous. Beginning to follow the girl to the kitchen, she felt her body relaxing, One of his main weapons is a staff, that may be it. You take one step onto my drying floor, Eldritch. Dark Shadow will be tasting splinters for weeks. Turning the corner, she felt a snort leave her mouth as Eldritch sat atop the fridge. Dark Shadow curled around him, looking just as traumatized, as Kumicho waved the mop threateningly in the general direction. The bird-headed boy had never seemed like the type to swear, but she couldn't help but burst into even more laughter at his words. This team is AF nightmare. I'll make you have time out on there if you keep that attitude up. Though both males' voices were loud and brash, the laughter that underlay both tones made the friendliness of the exchange visible.